Carl Jung explained, 13 spiritual warnings, that your soul is drifting away from the crowd. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the deep waters begin to move. It is not dramatic at first. No thunderclap announces it. No lightning splits the ordinary sky of your daily existence. Instead, it begins as the faintest stirring, like the first breath of wind that precedes the storm, or the subtle shift in light that signals dawn while the world still sleeps in darkness. You may not even recognize it initially. You are still walking the well-worn paths of collective existence, still wearing the familiar masks that have served you so faithfully in the theater of social life. Your days unfold in their predictable rhythms: work, relationships, obligations, the endless cycle of doing and being that modern life demands. Yet somewhere beneath this orchestrated surface, something ancient and eternal begins to wake. This is what Jung called the initial stirring of the self, that deeper, more comprehensive aspect of your being that exists beyond the narrow confines of your conscious ego. It is as if a seed, long dormant in the frozen ground of your psyche, suddenly feels the first warm touch of an inner spring. The soil of your unconscious begins to soften, and through hairline cracks in the hardened earth of your assumptions, something green and alive pushes toward the light. At first, you dismiss these stirrings as mere restlessness. Perhaps it's dissatisfaction with your job, or a vague sense that your relationships lack depth, or a growing feeling that the life you've built so carefully feels somehow hollow. You tell yourself these are normal fluctuations, the psychological equivalent of weather patterns that will soon pass. But the seed of authentic selfhood, once awakened, does not easily return to sleep. The collective consciousness that surrounds you, that great ocean of shared beliefs, values, and expectations, begins to feel less like home and more like a prison you hadn't noticed you were living in. The voices that once seemed like truth now sound like echoes bouncing off the walls of a cave. The certainties that once provided comfort begin to feel brittle, like ice cracking under the weight of a changing season. Jung understood this moment as both gift and curse. It is a gift because it signals that your psyche has reached a level of development where it can no longer be satisfied by the borrowed clothes of collective meaning. The persona, that carefully crafted public face you've learned to wear, no longer provides adequate expression for the complexity emerging from within. You are growing beyond the boundaries that once contained you, like a butterfly beginning to strain against the walls of its chrysalis. But it is also a curse because once this awakening begins, there is no comfortable return to unconsciousness. You cannot unknow what you have glimpsed, cannot unfeel what you have felt. The very foundations of your identity begin to shift, and with that shifting comes a profound disorientation that can feel like madness or death. The call from the depths is not a gentle invitation. It is more like the summons of an ancient god who will not be denied, a voice that speaks in the language of dreams, symptoms, and synchronicities. It may come through a breakdown that forces you to confront the inadequacy of your current life structure. It may manifest as a creative urge so powerful it disrupts your rational plans. It may appear as an inexplicable attraction to ideas, people, or experiences that your conscious mind finds disturbing or inappropriate. Sometimes the call comes through what Jung termed the confrontation with the opposite. You find yourself drawn to what you have always rejected, fascinated by what you have always feared. The careful balance of your personality begins to tip toward its other side, and you experience what feels like a reversal of everything you thought you knew about yourself. The introvert discovers an unexpected extroverted impulse. The rationalist finds themselves moved by irrational faith. The skeptic encounters mystery they cannot dismiss. This is the beginning of what Jung called Enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological attitudes to transform into their opposites when they become too extreme or one-sided. Your psyche, in its wisdom, begins to compensate for the imbalances that have accumulated over years of living according to external expectations rather than inner truth. The crowd around you continues its familiar dance, but you begin to hear a different music. Where others find comfort in consensus, you feel the stirring of questions that have no easy answers. Where others seek security in conformity, you sense the pale limitation of mass thinking. It is as if you have developed a new organ of perception that allows you to see through the elaborate constructions of collective life to something more essential, more real, and infinitely more demanding. This new perception brings with it a terrible loneliness. You realize that the connections you thought you had with others were often based on shared illusions rather than authentic meeting. The conversations that once satisfied now feel superficial, touching only the surface of what it means to be human. You begin to long for depth, for truth, for encounters that honor the mystery of existence rather than reducing it to comfortable platitudes. Yet within this loneliness lies the seed of genuine relationship, first with yourself and eventually with others who have also heard the call from the depths. Jung understood that true community could only be formed by individuals who had done the difficult work of becoming themselves, who had separated from the unconscious participation in collective identity to discover their own unique voice. The stirring in the depths is also the beginning of your relationship with the unconscious, that vast realm of psychic life that exists beyond the narrow beam of consciousness. You begin to pay attention to dreams that seem to carry messages from another world. Symbols appear in your life with uncanny timing, as if the universe itself is trying to communicate something essential that your rational mind alone cannot grasp. This is the realm of what Jung called the objective psyche, the deeper layers of the unconscious that connect you not only to your own forgotten potential, but to the archetypal patterns that have shaped human experience since the beginning of time. You begin to recognize in your own story the echoes of ancient myths, the recurring patterns of transformation that have guided souls through the darkness for millennia. The hero's journey begins not with a conscious decision to embark on an adventure, but with a disturbance in the ordinary world that can no longer be ignored. Odysseus did not choose to wander for 10 years. He was swept away by forces beyond his control. Dante did not decide to take a tour of hell. He found himself lost in a dark wood with no memory of how he got there. Similarly, your own journey of individuation begins not with a plan or a goal, but with a disruption that forces you to question everything you thought you knew. The call from the depths is both an ending and a beginning, the death of who you thought you were, and the birth of who you might become. As this process deepens, you may find yourself experiencing what mystics have long recognized as the dark night of the soul. The old certainties dissolve, but new ones have not yet crystallized. You exist in a liminal space between identities, between worlds, between the life you have lived and the life that wants to live through you. This can be a time of profound creativity and insight, but also of confusion, anxiety, and despair. Jung saw this dissolution as necessary preparation for psychological rebirth. Just as the caterpillar must dissolve into undifferentiated soup before it can reorganize as a butterfly, the ego must undergo a kind of death before the self can emerge in its fullness. The alchemists called this phase nigredo, the blackening, and understood it as the essential first stage in the transformation of base metal into gold. The call from the depths is ultimately a call to wholeness, but wholeness includes everything, not just the pleasant, acceptable aspects of yourself, but also the difficult, rejected, and shadow parts that you have spent years trying to ignore or overcome. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the journey, the recognition that becoming whole means embracing your full humanity, including the parts that the collective consciousness has taught you to despise or deny. Yet this embracing is not the same as acting out or indulging every impulse. Rather, it is the conscious recognition and integration of all aspects of your nature so that they can be transformed from unconscious compulsions into conscious choices. The shadow, when brought into awareness, loses its power to sabotage your life from behind the scenes and instead becomes a source of energy, creativity, and authentic power. The stirring in the depths is also a stirring of love, not the sentimental love of popular culture, but the fierce love of truth that is willing to sacrifice comfort for authenticity, security for growth, approval for integrity. This love demands everything and promises nothing except the possibility of living from your deepest truth, rather than from borrowed scripts and inherited expectations. As you feel this stirring within you, know that you are not alone. Across cultures and throughout history, human beings have felt this same call, have wrestled with the same angels, have walked the same narrow path between madness and wisdom. The forms change, but the essential pattern remains. The soul's refusal to remain asleep, its insistence on awakening to its own deepest nature, its willingness to risk everything for the possibility of becoming real. This is your invitation and your burden, your gift and your responsibility. The depths are calling, and though the journey ahead is uncertain, treacherous, and transformative, you have already taken the first step by feeling the stirring, by recognizing the voice that speaks from beyond the familiar boundaries of your conscious world. There is no map for the territory you are entering, but there is the ancient wisdom of the psyche itself, the guidance of dreams and symbols, and the compass of your own deepest truth to light the way. The seed is stirring in the depths. Your authentic self is beginning its slow emergence from the soil of the unconscious. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with this single step, the willingness to listen when the depths call your name, to feel when the stirring begins, to trust in the wisdom of your own soul's unfolding, even when you cannot see where it leads. The crowd may not understand, but the depths know exactly what they are doing. Your task now is to learn their language, to follow their guidance, and to trust in the mysterious intelligence that is orchestrating your transformation from within. The mask you have worn for so long, that carefully crafted persona that has served as your interface with the world, begins to show the first signs of strain. It is subtle at first, like the hairline fractures that appear in a dam before the waters break through. You notice it in moments of unexpected hesitation, when the practiced responses that once flowed so easily from your lips suddenly feel foreign in your mouth. The smile that once came automatically now requires conscious effort. The roles you have played with such conviction begin to feel like costumes that no longer fit the expanding soul within. Jung understood the persona as both necessity and limitation, a psychological structure that allows us to function in society while simultaneously constraining our fuller expression, like an actor who has played the same character for so many years that they have forgotten their own face beneath the makeup. You have become identified with this public self to such a degree that the distinction between who you are and who you appear to be has all but vanished. But now something fundamental is shifting. The stirring from the depths that began as a whisper has grown stronger, and its pressure against the rigid boundaries of your persona creates a tension that cannot be ignored. You find yourself in situations where your usual responses feel inadequate, where the familiar scripts no longer match the complexity of what you are experiencing internally. Perhaps it happens in a business meeting where you hear yourself speaking the expected words while another part of you watches with growing detachment, wondering who this person is that wears your name and speaks with your voice. Or maybe it occurs in a social gathering where the conversations that once engaged you now feel hollow, like elaborately choreographed dances that everyone performs, but no one truly enjoys. The laughter feels forced, the connections superficial, and you begin to sense the profound loneliness that can exist even in the midst of constant social interaction. This is the beginning of what depth psychology recognizes as the ego's first encounter with its own limitations. The ego, that organizing principle of consciousness that has worked so hard to maintain coherence and control, suddenly confronts the reality that there is far more to you than it has been able to acknowledge or express. It is like a gardener who has spent years carefully cultivating a small plot of land, only to discover that this plot sits at the edge of a vast wilderness that has always been there, waiting. The cracks in the persona often appear first as a kind of existential fatigue. You wake up in the morning and the prospect of putting on the familiar face feels exhausting before you even begin. The energy required to maintain the performance becomes increasingly difficult to summon. You might find yourself staring in the mirror, studying the features that have become so automatic, so practiced, wondering who lives behind those eyes that seem both familiar and strange. Sometimes the fracturing manifests as what appears to be inconsistency or contradiction in your behavior. Friends and family might comment that you seem different, that you're not quite yourself lately. They are more right than they know. You are indeed not quite yourself, because the self you have been is proving inadequate to contain the self you are becoming. The old boundaries are dissolving, and in that dissolution, new possibilities emerge. Jung spoke of individuation as a process that requires the dissolution of unconscious identification with the persona. This does not mean abandoning all social roles or becoming incapable of appropriate behavior in different contexts. Rather, it means developing a conscious relationship with these roles, wearing them as clothes rather than becoming them, maintaining awareness of the one who wears the mask even while the mask is being worn. But this transition is rarely smooth or comfortable. The ego, which has invested so much energy in constructing and maintaining the persona, experiences its breakdown as a kind of death. Everything that has provided stability and identity begins to feel uncertain. The ground that seemed so solid reveals itself to be shifting sand, and you find yourself in the disorienting position of having to rebuild your sense of self from the ground up. This process often triggers what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow, those aspects of yourself that were incompatible with the persona and thus relegated to the unconscious. As the mask weakens, these rejected parts begin to emerge, demanding recognition and integration. You might find yourself drawn to behaviors, thoughts, or feelings that your previous identity would have found unacceptable or embarrassing. The well-behaved person discovers rebellious impulses. The rational thinker finds themselves moved by irrational passions. The people-pleaser encounters their own capacity for selfishness and boundary setting. The cynic stumbles upon unexpected wells of hope and tenderness. These emergent aspects of yourself can feel foreign and frightening, like strangers moving into your carefully ordered house. Yet Jung understood these shadow encounters not as pathology, but as necessary steps toward wholeness. The persona, by definition, represents only a fraction of your total personality, the parts deemed acceptable by your family, culture, and social environment. The rest of you, equally valid and equally real, has been waiting in the wings, and as the persona's grip loosens, this fuller cast of characters begins to step into the light. This can be a time of great creativity and liberation. Many people report that as their personas begin to crack, they discover talents, interests, and capacities they never knew they possessed. The artist emerges in the accountant. The mystic awakens in the skeptic. The lover blooms in the person who thought themselves incapable of deep feeling. It is as if you have been living in only one room of a vast mansion, and suddenly doors begin opening to reveal chambers filled with treasures you never knew existed. But the process is also marked by significant anxiety and confusion. Without the familiar structure of the persona to organize your self-perception and guide your behavior, you may feel lost, chaotic, or fragmented. The psychological immune system that protected you from experiences that didn't fit your self-image is weakening, and you find yourself exposed to a much wider range of internal and external stimuli. Dreams during this period often feature imagery of houses with unknown rooms, masks falling away, clothing that no longer fits, or mirrors that reflect unfamiliar faces. The unconscious is attempting to communicate the magnitude of the transformation taking place, using the symbolic language that speaks directly to the soul rather than to the rational mind. The breakdown of the persona also affects your relationships in profound ways. People who knew you primarily through your mask may struggle to recognize or accept the emerging aspects of your personality. Some relationships built on mutual persona identification may not survive the transition. Others may deepen as you become capable of more authentic connection. You may find yourself drawn to new people who can meet you at the level of emerging truth rather than familiar performance. This relational shift can be particularly challenging because it often involves disappointing others' expectations of who you should be. The persona was, in many ways, a contract with the collective, an agreement to be a certain kind of person in exchange for acceptance and belonging. As you begin to renegotiate this contract or abandon it altogether, you may face disapproval, confusion, or even rejection from those who invested in your old identity. Yet Jung saw this social friction as inevitable and even necessary. True individuation requires the courage to disappoint others' projections and expectations in service of your own authenticity. This is not selfishness, but rather the recognition that genuine contribution to the collective can only come from individuals who have done the work of becoming themselves. The cracking of the persona also reveals the ways in which you have been living borrowed meanings rather than discovering your own. The values, beliefs, and goals that seem so important may be revealed as hand-me-downs from family, culture, or peer group, rather than authentic expressions of your own deepest nature. This can be particularly disorienting if you have built a successful life according to these borrowed blueprints. You may find yourself questioning not just how you present yourself to the world, but why you want what you thought you wanted, why you believe what you thought you believed, why you are who you thought you were. These questions have no easy answers, and the process of discovering your authentic responses can take years or even decades. The metaphor Jung often used for this process was the alchemical work of separating the pure from the impure, the essential from the accidental. The persona, useful as it has been, contains a mixture of authentic self-expression and adaptive camouflage. The work now is to separate these elements, keeping what serves your genuine nature while releasing what was merely protective coloration. This separation requires a kind of patient archaeology of the soul. You must dig through layers of conditioning, expectation, and adaptation to uncover what was originally and authentically yours. It is slow work, often frustrating, because the authentic self does not reveal itself according to your timeline or preferences. It emerges in its own season, like a flower that cannot be, forced to bloom before its time. As the mask continues to crack, you may experience what feels like a multiplicity of selves competing for expression. The persona's job was to present a unified, coherent face to the world, but as its control loosens, you discover that you are far more complex and contradictory than you ever imagined. You might feel different with different people, in different situations, at different times of day. This multiplicity can feel chaotic and unsettling, but it is actually a sign that you are beginning to access the fuller range of your humanity. Jung understood this phase as preparation for the emergence of what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension rather than choosing one side and rejecting the other. The persona typically operates through such choices, presenting only the aspects of yourself deemed appropriate for each context. But wholeness requires the ability to contain paradox, to be both strong and vulnerable, both rational and emotional, both individual and relational. The breakdown of the persona is ultimately a breakdown of psychological inflation, the unconscious identification with partial truths, as if they were complete realities. You begin to see that who you thought you were was never the whole story, that the identity you defended so carefully was always a construction rather than a discovery. This recognition can be humbling and liberating in equal measure. As this process continues, you may find that your face in the mirror begins to look different, not because your features have changed, but because the expression behind them is more complex, more alive, more real. The practiced look gives way to something more spontaneous and mysterious. You are beginning to see yourself with fresh eyes, as if meeting yourself for the first time. The mask is not your enemy. It served its purpose and may continue to serve in appropriate contexts. But it is no longer your master. You are learning to wear it consciously when it serves your purposes, and to remove it when authentic expression is called for. This is the beginning of psychological freedom, the ability to choose your responses rather than being chosen by them, to express your truth rather than merely performing your role. The cracks in the persona are cracks that let the light in. Through them, your deeper nature begins to shine, hesitant at first, like dawn breaking after a long night, but with increasing strength and clarity. The journey toward wholeness has begun in earnest, and though the path ahead is uncertain and challenging, you are no longer walking it as a stranger to yourself. The mask is cracking, and your true face is beginning to emerge. In the liminal hours when day surrenders to night and the ordinary world softens its grip on consciousness, something ancient and long denied begins to move within the depths of your psyche. The shadow, that repository of everything you have rejected, repressed, and refused to acknowledge about yourself, stirs like a creature awakening from deep hibernation. It has been patient, this darker twin of your conscious identity, feeding on the energy of your denials and growing stronger in the fertile darkness of your unconscious mind. Jung understood the shadow not as evil incarnate, but as the necessary other half of your completeness, the repository of all the qualities, impulses, and potentials that were incompatible with your ego's self-image and your persona's public presentation. Every choice to be one thing has been simultaneously a choice not to be something else, and that something else has not disappeared. It has merely gone underground, gathering its own intelligence, its own agenda, its own claims upon your life. Now, as the carefully constructed defenses of your conscious mind begin to weaken under the pressure of emerging authenticity, the shadow seizes its opportunity. It whispers through the cracks in your composure, emerges in your dreams wearing familiar yet disturbing faces, and manifests in the very qualities you find most irritating or fascinating in others. What you hate, what you judge, what you cannot understand in the people around you. These are often reflections of your own denied aspects, projected outward to maintain the illusion of your moral superiority or psychological cleanliness. The stirring of the shadow often begins with a growing sense of moral complexity that disturbs your previously clear-cut sense of right and wrong. You find yourself unexpectedly sympathetic to people you once dismissed or condemned. The criminal's desperation touches something in you that you would rather not examine. The addict's compulsion mirrors a hunger you recognize, but have never acknowledged. The fool's embarrassing authenticity reflects a freedom you secretly envy, but consciously despise. This is the beginning of what Jung called the moral problem of individuation, the recognition that becoming whole requires integrating not just your light, but also your darkness, not just your virtues, but also your capacity for what you have learned to call vice. It is perhaps the most challenging aspect of psychological development, because it threatens the very foundation of your identity as a good person, a rational person, a person who has successfully transcended the baser aspects of human nature. But the shadow will not be ignored indefinitely. Denied direct expression, it finds indirect ways to manifest, through slips of the tongue that reveal forbidden thoughts, through symptoms that force you to confront what you have been avoiding, through patterns of self-sabotage that undermine your conscious intentions. The very energy you spend trying to maintain your idealized self-image becomes the fuel that feeds your shadow's power to disrupt your life from behind the scenes. Jung observed that the shadow often appears first in dreams, wearing the face of figures who embody everything you find most repugnant or threatening. These dream figures pursue you through dark landscapes, threaten your safety, or tempt you with forbidden pleasures. Your unconscious is attempting to introduce you to aspects of yourself that your conscious mind has refused to meet, using the symbolic language of dreams to bypass your rational defenses. The shadow may also emerge through what depth psychology recognizes as possession. Those moments when you find yourself acting in ways that feel completely foreign to your normal personality. The patient person explodes in rage. The controlled person acts with reckless abandon. The generous person becomes petty and grasping. In these moments, you catch a glimpse of the complexity that lies beneath your carefully maintained surface, the wildness that exists alongside your civilization, the capacity for destruction that lives within your creativity. These experiences of being taken over by aspects of yourself you don't recognize can be deeply disturbing. They challenge your sense of being in control of your own personality and reveal the degree to which your conscious identity represents only a small fraction of your total psychological reality. Yet Jung saw such experiences as potentially valuable, involuntary introductions to parts of yourself that need to be consciously acknowledged and integrated. The shadow stirring in twilight also manifests as a growing fascination with what you have always avoided or condemned. The rationalist becomes obsessed with mysticism. The rule follower finds themselves drawn to rebellion. The people pleaser discovers the seductive power of selfishness. These attractions feel dangerous precisely because they threaten the stability of your established identity, yet they also carry the promise of a more complete and authentic way of being. Jung understood that every psychological attitude, when maintained too rigidly or exclusively, eventually constellates its opposite. The psyche seeks balance, and if you have spent years or decades identifying with only one pole of human experience, your shadow will inevitably be populated by all the opposite qualities you have rejected. This is why the most moral people often struggle with the most immoral impulses, why the most controlled people are haunted by chaos, why the most rational people are vulnerable to irrational obsessions. The twilight realm where the shadow stirs is also the domain of what Jung called the inferior function, that least developed aspect of your personality that carries tremendous creative potential precisely because it has remained unconscious and undifferentiated. If you have lived primarily through thinking, your shadow may be populated with intense feelings. If you have identified with intuition, your shadow may contain earthy sensations and practical concerns you have always dismissed as unworthy of your attention. This inferior function often emerges with primitive and potentially destructive energy because it has been so long denied conscious development. The intellectual who finally encounters their emotions may be overwhelmed by their intensity. The feeling type who contacts their thinking function may become coldly analytical in ways that damage their relationships. The sensation type who awakens to intuition may become lost in fantasies that disconnect them from practical reality. Yet Jung saw the integration of the inferior function as essential to psychological wholeness. It carries the very qualities that your conscious personality most needs to achieve balance and completion. The challenge is learning to relate to these emerging aspects with consciousness rather than being possessed by them, to dialogue with them rather than being overwhelmed by their primitive energy. The shadow's stirring also involves encountering what you might call your unlived life, all the paths you didn't take, the choices you didn't make, the potentials you sacrificed in service of becoming who you are. This unlived life doesn't simply disappear. It continues to exist in potential form within your psyche, sometimes manifesting as regret, sometimes as fantasy, sometimes as a haunting sense of incompleteness. In midlife, this encounter with the unlived life often becomes particularly acute. You may find yourself dreaming of careers you never pursued, relationships you never explored, adventures you never dared to undertake. These are not necessarily indications that you made wrong choices, but rather recognition that every choice involves sacrifice, and that sacrifice leaves traces in your unconscious that demand some form of acknowledgement. The integration of shadow material requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the ability to contain contradictory aspects of yourself without immediately resolving them into a false unity. This is profoundly challenging for the ego, which prefers clear categories and consistent self-images. Learning to live with your own contradictions, to be both selfish and generous, both wise and foolish, both strong and vulnerable, requires a fundamental shift from ego consciousness to what Jung termed self-consciousness, a broader perspective that can embrace the full spectrum of human possibility. The shadow's emergence often coincides with a period of what might be called moral relativism, a time when your previous certainties about good and evil, right and wrong, become clouded by complexity and nuance. This can be deeply unsettling if you have built your identity on clear moral principles, but it is also the beginning of a more mature and compassionate understanding of human nature. As you encounter your own capacity for what you have always condemned in others, judgment begins to transform into understanding. The recognition of your own darkness becomes the foundation for genuine empathy rather than the false compassion that is often merely disguised superiority. You begin to understand why people do what they do, not because you approve of their actions, but because you recognize the human struggles that give rise to both noble and ignoble choices. This integration of shadow material is not the same as acting out destructive impulses or abandoning moral discrimination. Rather, it involves bringing unconscious contents into consciousness, where they can be related to rather than possessed by. The angry person learns to acknowledge their rage without being controlled by it. The lustful person owns their desires without being enslaved by them. The greedy person recognizes their hunger without being consumed by it. Jung spoke of the shadow as containing not only personal repressions, but also collective shadow material, the accumulated darkness of your culture, your family lineage, and humanity itself. As you deepen into your own psychological work, you may find yourself confronting not just your individual darkness, but also the ways in which you carry the unresolved traumas and unacknowledged shadows of the groups to which you belong. This can manifest as unexpected encounters with ancestral patterns, cultural complexes, or collective guilt that seems to arise from beyond your personal experience. The privileged person suddenly feels the weight of systemic injustice. The innocent person encounters the violence that their peace depends upon. The civilized person meets the barbarian that civilization both contains and depends upon for its vitality. The stirring of the shadow in twilight is also an invitation to reclaim your instinctual nature, those aspects of yourself that connect you to the animal wisdom that predates and underlies human consciousness. Modern life often requires us to override our instincts in service of social adaptation, but this override comes at a cost. The shadow often carries the energy of these denied instincts, waiting for an opportunity to restore balance to an overly domesticated personality. As the shadow emerges, you may find yourself more connected to your body's wisdom, more aware of your genuine desires, more capable of appropriate aggression when your boundaries are violated. This is not a regression to primitive functioning, but rather an integration that allows conscious choice about when to follow instinct and when to override it. The twilight realm where shadow work occurs is also the domain of creative potential. Many of the greatest artists, writers, and innovators have drawn their power from their willingness to engage with shadow material, to explore the dark territories that others avoid, to give form to the rejected and repressed aspects of human experience. Your own creativity may deepen as you become willing to acknowledge and work with the full spectrum of your inner life. The shadow stirring in twilight ultimately represents the psyche's refusal to be limited by the narrow definitions of acceptability that govern conscious life. It is your soul's insistence on wholeness, even when that wholeness includes aspects of yourself that challenge your preferred self-image. This stirring marks the beginning of a more complete relationship with yourself, one that includes both light and dark, both acceptable and unacceptable, both the person you have tried to be and the person you have tried not to be. As you feel this stirring within yourself, recognize it not as a sign of moral failure, but as evidence of psychological health and the natural unfolding of individuation. The shadow's emergence is not something to be feared, but something to be engaged with consciousness, courage, and compassion. It is the return of your exiled aspects, seeking not to destroy your conscious identity, but to enrich it with dimensions of experience you have long denied yourself. The twilight hour when shadow stirs is also the hour when transformation becomes possible. In the darkness that contains both terror and treasure, the work of integration begins. You are no longer content to be half of yourself. You are ready to embrace the full mystery of your humanity with all its light and darkness, all its beauty and terror, all its potential for both creation and destruction. The shadow stirs, and in that stirring, your journey toward wholeness deepens into territories that only the brave dare to explore. The comfortable certainties that once anchored your existence begin to dissolve like salt in water, leaving behind a solution so saturated with ambiguity that it can no longer hold the crystalline structures of belief that once gave your life its apparent solidity. You find yourself in the strange position of knowing less than you thought you knew, understanding less than you believed you understood, certain of less than you were once certain of. This is not ignorance returning, but rather ignorance revealed, the recognition that what you took for knowledge was often merely comfortable assumption, and what you mistook for understanding was frequently just familiar repetition. Jung called this phase the nigredo, the blackening, borrowing from the alchemical tradition that understood transformation as requiring a period of dissolution before any new synthesis becomes possible. Like the alchemist who must break down base metals into their constituent elements before transmuting them into gold, your psyche must dissolve the false certainties of ego consciousness before the deeper wisdom of the self can emerge. This dissolution feels like death because, in a very real sense, It is death. The death of who you thought you were and what you thought you knew about the nature of existence. The questions that arise during this phase are not the comfortable questions that have reassuring answers waiting in textbooks or traditions. These are the questions that emerge from the depths of being itself, questions that seem to arise from the very structure of consciousness, confronting its own mysterious nature. Why does anything exist at all rather than nothing? What is the relationship between the observer and the observed? How can consciousness study itself without fundamentally altering what it observes? What does it mean to be human in a universe that seems indifferent to human concerns? These questions arrive not as intellectual curiosities, but as existential imperatives that demand your complete attention and engagement. They wake you in the night with their urgency, follow you through your daily routines with their persistence, and color every conversation with their undertone of cosmic uncertainty. You cannot dismiss them as philosophical luxuries because they have become the very air you breathe, the water you swim in, the ground you walk on, or rather the absence of ground beneath your feet. The ego, which has always derived its sense of security from having answers, experiences this questioning as a kind of psychological free fall. Everything it has used to orient itself in the world becomes suspect. The beliefs inherited from family, culture, and education reveal themselves as constructions rather than discoveries. The values that once seemed self-evident appear arbitrary when examined from different angles. The meanings that once felt absolute begin to show their relative and contextual nature. This is particularly disorienting for those who have built their identity around being knowledgeable, competent, or wise. The scholar discovers the limitations of scholarship. The expert encounters the boundaries of expertise. The spiritual teacher meets the mystery that cannot be taught. The certainty that once provided a foundation for confidence transforms into the uncertainty that undermines all previous sources of security. Yet Jung understood this dissolution not as pathology, but as necessary preparation for a more mature relationship with truth. The ego's relationship to knowledge is essentially possessive. It wants to have answers, to hold certainties, to own truths that can be deployed when needed. But the self's relationship to wisdom is participatory. It knows by being, understands through communion, grasps truth through surrender to mystery rather than mastery of information. The questions without answers that characterize this phase often center around the fundamental paradoxes of human existence. How can you be both insignificant and supremely important? How can life be both meaningful and absurd? How can you be both separate individual consciousness and inseparable part of the cosmic whole? How can you exercise free will in a deterministic universe? How can you maintain hope in the face of inevitable death? These are not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be lived. They require a different kind of intelligence than the rational mind typically employs, what Jung termed the transcendent function, which can hold opposites in creative tension rather than collapsing them into premature resolution. This function develops slowly through the patient practice of sitting with paradox, allowing contradictions to coexist, resisting the ego's compulsion to choose sides in every apparent conflict. The dissolution of certainties often manifests as what might be called epistemological vertigo, a dizzying sense that the very foundations of knowledge have become unreliable. How do you know what you know? How do you distinguish between perception and projection, between objective reality and subjective interpretation? How do you separate what is actually there from what you bring to your observation of what is there? These questions become particularly acute as you begin to recognize the degree to which your experience of reality is shaped by unconscious assumptions, cultural conditioning, and psychological complexes. What you took to be direct perception reveals itself as elaborate construction. What seemed like objective observation proves to be subjective interpretation. The solid world begins to feel more like a collaborative hallucination that we all agree to participate in for purposes of survival and communication. This recognition can trigger what existential philosophers call the experience of the absurd, the confrontation between human need for meaning and the universe's apparent meaninglessness. You find yourself like Sisyphus, eternally pushing the boulder of existence up the mountain of mortality, knowing it will roll back down, wondering why you continue the effort. Yet in this confrontation with absurdity, something unexpected may emerge. Not the despair that might seem logical, but a strange kind of freedom born from the recognition that meaning is not discovered, but created. The questions without answers also illuminate the arbitrary nature of the boundaries that usually organize experience. Where does the self end and the world begin? When does a thought become an action? How do you separate cause from effect in a universe where everything influences everything else? What distinguishes sanity from madness when both involve stories we tell ourselves about the nature of reality? These boundary dissolutions can be deeply unsettling for consciousness that is accustomed to clear categories and distinct separations, yet they also open doorways to ways of being that transcend the usual subject-object dualism that governs ordinary awareness. You may find yourself experiencing moments when the boundary between observer and observed becomes permeable, when the distinction between self and world temporarily dissolves, when consciousness reveals itself as something far more fluid and mysterious than you ever imagined. Jung observed that this phase of questioning often coincides with what he called the transcendent function beginning to constellate, the emergence of a new attitude that can embrace contradiction, paradox, and mystery as features of reality rather than problems to be solved. This function represents a kind of cognitive evolution, a development beyond the either-or, thinking that characterizes ego consciousness toward the both-and, awareness that characterizes self-consciousness. The development of the transcendent function requires learning to tolerate what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when holding conflicting beliefs, ideas, or perceptions simultaneously. Most people resolve this discomfort by choosing one side and rejecting the other, but the individuation process requires developing the capacity to hold the tension until a third option emerges that transcends both original positions. This is the psychological equivalent of what mystics have long recognized as the via negativa, the path of unknowing that proceeds by systematically releasing false certainties rather than accumulating new beliefs. It is the recognition that truth is often found not in what you can say about reality, but in what you must remain silent about, not in what you can grasp, but in what grasps you, not in what you can explain, but in what explains itself, through your willingness to be explained by it. The questions without answers often center around the relationship between consciousness and its contents. Are you the thoughts that arise in your mind? Or are you the awareness in which thoughts arise? Are you the emotions that sweep through your experience? Or are you the space in which emotions appear and disappear? Are you the memories that seem to constitute your personal history? Or are you the mysterious presence that remembers and is remembered? These investigations into the nature of identity often reveal what Buddhist psychology calls the illusion of the solid self, the recognition that what you take to be your fixed identity is actually a fluid process rather than a static entity. This discovery can be simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it frees you from the prison of rigid self-concept, terrifying because it undermines the very foundation of psychological security. The dissolution phase also brings encounters with what Jung termed the collective unconscious, those deeper layers of psychic life that connect individual consciousness to the archetypal patterns that have shaped human experience throughout history. You may find yourself dreaming dreams that seem to come from beyond your personal experience, having insights that feel more discovered than created, encountering symbols that carry meaning you cannot rationally explain but somehow recognize at a level deeper than thought. These encounters with the archetypal dimension of existence can be overwhelming for consciousness that is accustomed to maintaining clear boundaries between self and not self, between personal and impersonal, between individual and collective. Yet they also offer glimpses of a way of being that transcends the isolation of separate selfhood, connecting you to the larger patterns and purposes that give life its deeper significance. The questions without answers that characterize this phase often reveal the inadequacy of ordinary language to capture the subtlety and complexity of inner experience. How do you describe the indescribable? How do you communicate the incommunicable? How do you share insights that can only be known through direct experience rather than conceptual understanding? This linguistic limitation forces a recognition that much of what matters most in human experience lies beyond the reach of rational discourse. The most important truths cannot be proven, they can only be lived. The deepest meanings cannot be explained, they can only be embodied. The highest wisdom cannot be taught, it can only be awakened through direct encounter with the mystery that consciousness ultimately is. Jung understood this phase of questioning as essential preparation for what he called the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage between conscious and unconscious, ego and self, personal and transpersonal, that marks the achievement of psychological wholeness. But this marriage cannot occur while consciousness remains identified with its own limited perspective, while the ego insists on being the sole authority over meaning and truth. The dissolution of certainty serves the essential function of humbling the ego, revealing its proper place as servant rather than master of the total personality. This humbling is not humiliation, but rather the restoration of right relationship. Ego consciousness taking its appropriate role as the executive function of a much larger and more mysterious totality that Jung called the self. As you navigate this phase of questions without answers, you may find that the very act of questioning becomes more important than finding answers. The quality of your wondering becomes more significant than the content of your conclusions. The depth of your not knowing becomes more valuable than the breadth of your information. You begin to understand what Rilke meant when he advised living the questions, allowing them to shape you rather than demanding that you solve them. This is the beginning of what might be called wisdom, not the accumulation of correct answers, but the development of appropriate relationship with mystery. Wisdom knows when to know and when to unknow, when to grasp and when to release, when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent. It is comfortable with ambiguity because it recognizes ambiguity as the natural state of a reality, too complex and dynamic to be captured in any single perspective or system of thought. The questions without answers ultimately point toward the recognition that consciousness itself is the deepest mystery, not something you have, but something you are, not something you can study objectively, but something that studies itself through your willingness to be studied, not something you can explain, but something that explains itself through your openness to being explained. In this Negredo phase of psychological alchemy, you are being prepared for rebirth into a more mature relationship with reality, one that can embrace uncertainty as fertile ground rather than threat, paradox as revelation rather than confusion, mystery as invitation rather than obstacle. The base metal of ego certainty is dissolving into the prima materia from which the gold of authentic wisdom can eventually emerge. The questions continue to arise, wave after wave of uncertainty washing over the shores of what you thought you knew. But now you begin to sense that this dissolution is not destruction but preparation, not ending but beginning, not the death of understanding but its metamorphosis into something far more subtle, flexible, and alive than anything you have known before. The questions have no answers, but they are transforming you into the kind of being who no longer needs the false security of premature closure, who can dance with uncertainty as partner rather than opponent, who can find in the depths of not knowing a kind of knowing that surpasses all understanding. In the deepest chambers of your being, where the familiar voices of the world grow dim and distant, a profound shift begins to stir. You find yourself drawn away from the constant hum of collective consciousness, away from the endless demands for your attention, your energy, your very essence. Like a moth that has grown weary of the artificial flames that burn but do not warm, your soul begins to seek a different kind of illumination, one that emanates not from external sources, but from the mysterious depths within. This is the call to solitude, but not the solitude of the lonely heart or the abandoned spirit. This is the sacred withdrawal that Jung understood as essential to the process of becoming whole. It is the hermit's journey, where you learn to carry your own lantern through the vast wilderness of the unconscious mind, trusting in a light that flickers not with the borrowed fire of others' expectations, but with the eternal flame of your own deepest knowing. The world will not understand this turning inward. The collective consciousness, with its relentless hunger for participation, for conformity, for the comfort of shared illusions, will whisper that you are losing yourself, that you are becoming antisocial, that you are abandoning your responsibilities to the great machinery of human interaction. But your soul knows better. It recognizes this withdrawal not as an abandonment, but as a homecoming, a return to the source from which all authentic engagement must eventually spring. In the beginning, the silence feels vast and threatening. You have grown so accustomed to filling the spaces of your existence with the noise of others, their voices, their opinions, their endless chatter about the surface of things, that when these sounds begin to fade, what remains feels almost unbearably empty. But emptiness, your soul discovers, is not the same as void. Emptiness is space, sacred space in which something new can be born. The hermit's lantern is not lit all at once. It begins as the faintest glimmer, barely perceptible against the overwhelming darkness of all that you do not yet know about yourself. But in the practice of solitude, in the patient tending of your inner flame, this light grows stronger, more steady, more trustworthy. You begin to see that what you had taken for darkness was not emptiness at all, but richness, the fertile soil of the unconscious, pregnant with possibilities that can only germinate in the quiet depths of solitary contemplation. Jung spoke of this as the necessary descent, the journey into the underworld of the psyche where the ego's bright certainties dissolve into something far more mysterious and profound. The hermit carries his lantern not to banish the darkness, but to move safely within it, to explore its contours, to discover its hidden treasures, for it is in the darkness that the most precious aspects of the self reside, those parts of your being that have been exiled by the harsh light of social expectation, those tender shoots of authentic selfhood that can only grow in the protected quiet of your own company. The crowd, with its constant movement and noise, creates a kind of hypnosis, a trance state in which individual consciousness becomes submerged in the collective stream. In this trance, you forget that you have your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own unique way of perceiving reality. You begin to mistake the crowd's voice for your own, its desires for your desires, its fears for your fears. The hermit's journey is the gradual awakening from this trance, the slow remembering of what it means to think your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, walk your own path through the mystery of existence. But solitude is not mere isolation. The hermit does not flee from life. Rather, he withdraws to a deeper engagement with life, an engagement that is possible only when the noise of external demands has quieted enough for the whispers of the soul to be heard. In the silence, you begin to notice things that were always present but never acknowledged. The rhythm of your own breathing, the particular quality of your own thoughts, the subtle movements of energy within your body, the dreams that visit you in the night, carrying messages from realms beyond the conscious mind. This is where the real work begins, not the work of the ego with its endless projects of self-improvement and social advancement, but the work of the soul, which is concerned with something far more fundamental, the gradual revelation of who you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning, expectation, and borrowed identity. The hermit's lantern illuminates this process, casting light on the forgotten corners of your being, revealing treasures that have been hidden even from yourself. In solitude, you discover that you are far more complex, far more mysterious, far more interesting than the simplified version of yourself that you present to the world. The persona, that carefully crafted mask that Jung identified as the interface between the individual and society, begins to relax its grip. In the privacy of your own company, you no longer need to maintain the exhausting performance of being who others expect you to be. You can simply be, and in that simple being, the authentic self begins to emerge like a shy animal stepping cautiously into a clearing. The hermit's lantern reveals not only light, but shadow, those aspects of yourself that you have learned to hide, to deny, to project onto others. But in the compassionate solitude of your inner sanctuary, these shadow aspects need not be enemies to be conquered, or flaws to be eliminated. They can be recognized as parts of the whole, aspects of your humanity that have been split off and abandoned, but that carry their own wisdom, their own energy, their own gifts, to offer the process of becoming complete. Jung understood that the shadow is not evil, it is simply unconscious. It is the repository of all the life force that has been deemed unacceptable by the conscious mind, all the wildness and authenticity that has been sacrificed on the altar of social respectability. The hermit's journey into solitude is, in part, a retrieval mission, a careful, loving expedition into the territories of the self that have been abandoned or exiled, bringing back the lost pieces and integrating them into a more whole and authentic way of being. This integration cannot happen in the constant presence of others, because the presence of others automatically activates the persona, the social self, that must maintain its acceptable image. Only in solitude can you afford to be completely honest with yourself, to acknowledge the parts of your nature that do not fit the story you have been telling about who you are. Only in the hermit's sanctuary can you afford to let the mask slip completely, to see your own face in its unguarded truth. The hermit carries not just any light, but his own light, the illumination that comes from within, the wisdom that arises from direct engagement with the depths of his own being. This is not the borrowed light of external authorities, not the reflected glow of social approval, but the steady flame of inner knowing that burns regardless of external circumstances. This light cannot be extinguished by the disapproval of others, cannot be dimmed by the failure to meet external expectations, because it draws its fuel from the inexhaustible source of authentic selfhood. As you learn to trust this inner light, remarkable changes begin to occur in your relationship with the world. Paradoxically, as you withdraw from the constant need for external validation, you become more genuinely available to others. As you stop trying so hard to fit in, you discover your own unique way of belonging. As you cease the exhausting effort to be what others want you to be, you begin to offer what only you can give, the irreplaceable gift of your authentic presence. The hermit's solitude is not permanent exile, but sacred preparation. Like the seed that must rest in the darkness of the soil before it can break through into the light, your soul requires this time of inner incubation, this patient tending of the inner flame, before it can emerge transformed. The withdrawal is not an end in itself, but a means, a necessary stage in the larger journey toward wholeness that Jung called individuation. In the quiet depths of solitary reflection, you begin to hear voices that were always speaking, but were drowned out by the noise of collective consciousness. These are the voices of your deeper wisdom, your intuitive knowing, your soul's own guidance system that operates not through logic or analysis, but through symbol, metaphor, and direct inner sensing. The hermit learns to trust these voices, to rely on this inner guidance, to navigate by the stars of his own inner sky, rather than by the shifting winds of external opinion. The hermit's lantern also illuminates the path ahead, not the entire journey, for that would rob the adventure of its mystery, but just enough to take the next step and then the next. This is how the soul moves through the process of transformation, not with grand plans and detailed maps, but with the patient willingness to follow the light that is given, trusting that each step will reveal the next step, that each moment of authentic engagement will open the door to the next moment of possibility. As your soul grows more comfortable in the hermit's sanctuary, you discover that solitude is not the opposite of relationship, but its foundation. Only when you know who you are alone can you truly know who you are with others. Only when you have learned to enjoy your own company can you offer genuine companionship to another. Only when you have found your own center can you dance with others without losing yourself in the dance. The hermit's journey is ultimately a journey toward freedom, not the shallow freedom of doing whatever you want, but the deep freedom of being who you are. This freedom cannot be granted by external circumstances or political systems. It can only be won through the patient, loving exploration of your own inner territory. It is the freedom that comes from knowing yourself so thoroughly that you can no longer be manipulated by the promises and threats of the collective. The freedom that arises from trusting your own inner guidance more than the shifting currents of social opinion. In this sanctuary of solitude, your soul begins to remember its own rhythm, its own timing, its own way of moving through the world. You discover that you have your own seasons, times for engagement and times for withdrawal, times for action and times for reflection, times for speaking and times for listening. The hermit learns to honor these natural rhythms, to trust the wisdom of his own inner cycles rather than forcing himself to conform to the artificial schedules and expectations of the collective. The lantern that the hermit carries is not just a source of light, but a symbol of consciousness itself. The awakened awareness that can illuminate any situation, any challenge, any mystery that life presents. This consciousness is not dependent on external circumstances for its operation. It is a flame that burns from within, fueled by the inexhaustible source of authentic being. With this lantern, the hermit can navigate any territory, explore any depth, face any truth that the journey of individuation reveals. As this sacred solitude deepens and matures, you begin to understand that the hermit's withdrawal is not a rejection of life, but a deeper embrace of it. By stepping back from the surface currents of social interaction, you gain access to the deeper currents that move beneath. The archetypal energies, the mythic patterns, the eternal themes that give life its meaning and depth. The hermit sees not just the immediate drama of daily existence, but the larger story in which that drama is embedded. The hermit's lantern reveals that you are not just an isolated individual struggling to make sense of a chaotic world, but a unique expression of the eternal human story, the ancient journey of consciousness toward greater awareness, greater wholeness, greater authentic being. In the quiet of your solitary sanctuary, you can hear the echoes of all who have walked this path before you, the whispered encouragement of ancestors and guides who understand the courage required to trust your own inner light in a world that often seems committed to extinguishing it. This is the gift that the hermit eventually brings back to the world, the knowledge that there is another way to live, another source of guidance, another kind of wisdom that does not depend on external validation or approval. The hermit returns not to preach or convince, but simply to embody this possibility, to be a living demonstration that it is possible to trust the light within, to follow the guidance of the soul, to walk the path of authentic selfhood, even in a world that may not understand or support such a journey. In the sacred hours when consciousness releases its grip and the soul descends into the realm of sleep, something extraordinary begins to unfold. The rational mind, with its endless cataloging and controlling, steps aside, and in its place emerges a far more ancient intelligence, the wisdom of dreams that speaks not in the linear language of the day, but in the fluid, symbolic tongue of the unconscious. Here, in this liminal space between waking and sleeping, between knowing and unknowing, your soul encounters messages that the daylight world, with all its noise and urgency, could never deliver. Jung recognized dreams as letters from the unconscious, missives sent from the depths of the psyche to the surface consciousness, carrying information that could not be conveyed through any other means. But as your journey into authentic selfhood deepens, these nocturnal communications begin to shift from occasional whispers to insistent proclamations. The dream world, once perhaps dismissed as mere mental housekeeping or random neural firing, reveals itself as a realm of profound intelligence, a source of guidance that operates according to laws far more sophisticated than the crude mechanics of logical thought. This is the moment when dreams begin to speak louder than daylight, when the visions that visit you in sleep carry more truth, more relevance, more practical wisdom than all the advice and analysis that the waking world can offer. Your soul, having begun its withdrawal from the collective trance, finds itself naturally attuned to this deeper frequency, this more ancient way of knowing that has guided human consciousness since the beginning of time. The transformation is subtle at first. Perhaps you notice that you remember your dreams more vividly, that they linger in your awareness long after awakening, refusing to be dismissed as mere fantasy. The images are more striking, more emotionally charged, more personally meaningful than they have ever been before. Colors seem more saturated, emotions more intense, symbols more pregnant with significance. It is as if a veil has been lifted, revealing a dimension of experience that was always present but previously ignored. Jung understood that dreams operate according to a logic entirely different from that of waking consciousness. Where the conscious mind seeks clarity, consistency, and linear progression, the dream consciousness embraces paradox, contradiction, and symbolic representation. A single dream image can contain multiple layers of meaning, can represent simultaneously past and future, self and other, problem and solution. This is not confusion, but rather a more sophisticated form of intelligence, one that can hold multiple truths at once, without needing to resolve them into a single, simplified conclusion. As your soul grows more receptive to this dream wisdom, you begin to notice that the symbols and metaphors that populate your nighttime visions carry information that is startlingly relevant to your waking life. A dream of drowning might precede and illuminate a period of emotional overwhelm. A vision of flying might herald a breakthrough in creative expression or spiritual understanding. An encounter with an animal might introduce you to an aspect of your own instinctual nature that consciousness has long ignored or suppressed. But the dreams do not merely reflect your current psychological state. They seem to anticipate, to guide, to offer solutions to problems that your conscious mind has not yet fully recognized. It is as if the unconscious possesses a kind of prescient intelligence, able to perceive patterns and possibilities that lie beyond the reach of rational analysis. The dreams begin to feel less like random productions of a sleeping brain and more like consultations with a wise inner teacher who sees the larger patterns of your life with remarkable clarity. This shift toward symbolic thinking marks a fundamental transformation in how your soul processes and understands reality. The daylight world operates primarily through literal interpretation, through concrete facts and logical relationships, but the dream world reveals that reality itself is far more fluid, far more symbolic, far more open to multiple interpretations than the conscious mind typically acknowledges. In dreams, a house might represent the psyche, a journey might symbolize psychological transformation, a death might herald rebirth rather than ending. As you learn to think symbolically, to read the metaphorical language that dreams employ, you discover that this way of understanding illuminates not only your nighttime visions but your waking experience as well. The events of your daily life begin to reveal symbolic dimensions, deeper patterns and meanings that were invisible when viewed through the narrow lens of literal interpretation. A chance encounter becomes a meaningful synchronicity. A recurring problem reveals itself as a symbolic teacher. A crisis transforms into an initiation. Jung called this the symbolic attitude, the ability to perceive the deeper archetypal significance that lies within ordinary events. It is a way of seeing that recognizes the sacred within the mundane, the eternal within the temporal, the universal within the personal. Dreams are perhaps the most natural teacher of this symbolic attitude, for in dreams we are immersed in a world where everything is symbol, where every image carries meaning beyond its surface appearance. The dream world operates according to what Jung termed the transcendent function, the psyche's natural ability to bridge opposites, to find connections between seemingly unrelated elements, to create new possibilities through the creative tension between conscious and unconscious contents. In dreams, the rigid boundaries that separate past from present, self from other, possible from impossible, dissolve and reform in endlessly creative combinations. This fluidity is not chaos, but rather a higher order of organization, one that can reveal solutions and insights that linear thinking could never achieve. As your dream life becomes more vivid and meaningful, you may find that the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness begins to blur in surprising ways. Dreams begin to influence your waking choices, to guide your decisions, to offer perspective on challenges that seemed insurmountable from the limited viewpoint of conscious reasoning. You might find yourself consulting your dreams like an oracle, waiting to see what wisdom the night will bring, trusting in this deeper source of guidance more than the endless analysis and advice-giving of the daylight world. This trust in dream wisdom represents a profound shift in the locus of authority in your life. Rather than seeking answers from external experts, from books and teachers and gurus, you begin to recognize that the most relevant guidance comes from within, from the deep well of wisdom that is accessible through the symbolic communications of the unconscious. Your dreams become a direct line of communication with the self, that archetypal center of wholeness that Jung understood as the true organizing principle of the psyche. The dreams that speak louder than daylight often carry archetypal themes and images that connect your personal journey to the universal patterns of human experience. You might dream of ancient temples, mythological creatures, primordial landscapes, or timeless rituals. These are not merely personal fantasies, but encounters with the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of the psyche that contains the inherited wisdom of humanity. Through these archetypal dreams, your individual transformation connects to the larger story of human consciousness, revealing that your personal journey of awakening is part of a much grander pattern. In some dreams, you may encounter figures that seem to possess a wisdom and authority that transcends your ordinary sense of self. Jung called these dream figures representations of the self, appearances of that deeper intelligence that guides the individuation process. These figures might appear as wise old men or women, as luminous beings, as powerful animals, or sometimes as ordinary people who speak with extraordinary insight. They offer guidance, issue challenges, reveal hidden truths, or simply stand as witnesses to your transformation. Learning to recognize and dialogue with these inner figures becomes a crucial skill in navigating the journey toward wholeness. The symbolic language of dreams also reveals the active presence of what Jung called the anima and animus, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche that carry the seeds of psychological completion. In dreams, these figures might appear as romantic partners, as mysterious strangers, as guides or teachers who possess qualities that seem to complement or challenge your conscious personality. Through relationship with these dream figures, you begin to integrate aspects of yourself that have been split off or projected, moving toward the psychological androgyny that characterizes the individuated personality. As dreams begin to speak louder than daylight, you may also encounter the shadow in its myriad forms, those aspects of yourself that have been rejected, repressed, or denied. But in the accepting space of dream consciousness, these shadow figures need not be feared or fought. They can be met with curiosity, dialogued with, even befriended. Dreams provide a safe space for shadow integration, allowing you to engage with the rejected aspects of yourself without the social consequences that might attend such encounters in waking life. The transformation of your dream life often coincides with an increased sensitivity to synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that seem to bridge the inner and outer worlds in ways that rational causality cannot explain. Images from dreams begin to appear in waking life. Dream themes echo in external events, and the boundary between inner symbolic reality and outer literal reality becomes increasingly permeable. This is not a sign of losing touch with reality, but rather of discovering that reality is far more mysterious, far more interconnected than the mechanical worldview of modern consciousness typically acknowledges. Jung understood synchronicity as evidence of the fundamental unity that underlies the apparent separateness of inner and outer experience. When dreams speak louder than daylight, when the symbolic dimension of experience becomes more real and relevant than its literal surface, you begin to live in a world where meaning is not imposed from without, but discovered from within, where guidance comes not from external authorities, but from the deep wisdom of your own soul. This shift toward dream consciousness also changes your relationship with time. Linear, chronological time, the relentless forward march of minutes and hours and days, begins to feel less absolute, less constraining. Dream time operates according to different principles. Past and future can coexist in a single moment. Cause and effect can reverse their usual order, and the eternal can break through into temporal experience. As you become more attuned to dream consciousness, you begin to experience what Jung called kairos, sacred time, meaningful time, time that is measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the significance of moments. The dreams that speak louder than daylight often carry a quality of numinosity, that sense of encounter with the sacred, the mysterious, the wholly other that Rudolf Otto identified as the essence of religious experience. These dreams feel different from ordinary dreams, charged with an energy and significance that lingers long after awakening. They may feature luminous landscapes, encounters with divine or mythological figures, or experiences of transcendence that temporarily lift consciousness beyond its ordinary limitations. Such dreams serve as reminders that the journey of individuation is not merely a psychological process, but a spiritual adventure that connects you to the deepest mysteries of existence. As your soul learns to trust the wisdom of dreams more than the certainties of daylight consciousness, you discover that you are not alone in your journey toward wholeness. The dream world is populated by guides, teachers, and allies who offer support and direction in ways that the waking world, with its emphasis on independence and self-reliance, rarely provides. These dream companions might appear as animals, as people from your past, as complete strangers, or as beings that seem to belong to other realms entirely. Learning to recognize and receive their guidance becomes an essential aspect of navigating the transformation process. The increasing prominence of dream wisdom in your life marks a return to a more ancient way of knowing, one that existed long before the rise of rational scientific consciousness began to dominate human understanding. Indigenous peoples around the world have always recognized dreams as sources of guidance, prophecy, and spiritual instruction. As your soul reclaims its connection to this deeper wisdom, you join an ancient tradition of dreamers who have used the symbolic language of the unconscious to navigate the challenges and opportunities of human existence. This transformation culminates in the recognition that dreams are not separate from waking life, but are rather another dimension of the same unified field of consciousness. The symbols and metaphors that populate your dreams begin to illuminate the symbolic dimension of your waking experience, revealing that all of life is, in a sense, a dream, a symbolic representation of deeper truths that can only be fully apprehended through the eyes of the soul. When dreams speak louder than daylight, you have learned to hear the voice of that deeper intelligence that guides the journey toward wholeness, the ancient wisdom that speaks not in the crude language of concepts and arguments, but in the subtle, powerful tongue of symbol and metaphor. In the deepest chambers of transformation, where the soul's journey toward wholeness reaches a crucial threshold, a remarkable phenomenon begins to emerge. The very contradictions that once tormented your consciousness, the opposing forces that seem to tear at the fabric of your being, begin to reveal themselves in an entirely new light. What Jung called Enantiodromia, the psyche's profound tendency to seek balance by swinging toward its opposite, begins to manifest not as chaos or confusion, but as a sacred dance, a divine choreography in which polarities learn to move together in harmonious tension. This is the moment when your soul discovers that opposites are not enemies to be conquered or problems to be solved, but partners in an eternal waltz of becoming. The fierce dualities that have shaped human consciousness since the dawn of awareness, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, order and chaos, love and fear, reveal themselves as complementary aspects of a greater whole, each one incomplete without its seeming opposite, each one reaching toward unity through the very tension that appears to separate them. The recognition begins gradually, perhaps with a dawning awareness that your greatest strengths and your deepest weaknesses are often two faces of the same underlying energy. The passion that drives your most creative expressions may be the same fire that fuels your destructive impulses. The sensitivity that allows you to perceive beauty and meaning with exquisite clarity may also be the vulnerability that leaves you raw and exposed to life's harsher realities. The independence that grants you freedom may be the same force that isolates you from intimate connection. Jung understood that the psyche's natural movement toward wholeness requires the integration of these apparent contradictions rather than the victory of one side over the other. The goal of individuation is not to become purely good, purely rational, or purely anything, but to become consciously whole, to embrace the full spectrum of human possibility without being torn apart by its inherent tensions. This integration happens not through the elimination of paradox, but through learning to hold paradox with increasing grace and wisdom. The dance of opposites is perhaps most clearly visible in the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. The conscious mind, with its need for control, clarity, and coherent narrative, naturally seeks to maintain its dominance over the chaotic, irrational, unpredictable realm of unconscious content. But as your soul matures in its journey toward wholeness, you begin to recognize that consciousness without the unconscious is sterile, mechanical, cut off from the very sources of creativity and life that give existence its meaning and vitality. The unconscious, in turn, requires consciousness to give it form, direction, and meaning. Without the organizing principle of conscious awareness, unconscious contents remain merely potential, forever churning in the depths, without ever crystallizing into actual experience or creative expression. The dance between conscious and unconscious is thus not a battle for supremacy, but a collaboration between complementary partners, each one offering what the other lacks, each one incomplete without the other's contribution. This same principle applies to the relationship between what Jung called the masculine and feminine principles within the psyche, not biological gender but archetypal energies that exist within every human soul, regardless of physical sex. The masculine principle embodies the qualities of focus, direction, analysis, structure, penetration, and achievement. The feminine principle encompasses receptivity, intuition, flow, connection, nurturing, and being. In the unconscious person, these principles often exist in opposition, with one dominating consciousness, while the other remains relegated to the shadows. But in the dance of opposites, the soul learns to honor both masculine and feminine energies, allowing them to complement and inform each other rather than compete for dominance. The result is not androgyny in any literal sense, but rather a psychological wholeness in which action is informed by receptivity, strength is tempered by gentleness, achievement is balanced by being, and the drive to penetrate mystery is matched by the wisdom to receive its revelations. The same integration must occur between the forces of order and chaos that govern human experience. Order represents the known, the predictable, the safe structures that consciousness creates to navigate the complexities of existence. Chaos represents the unknown, the creative, the fertile void from which new possibilities emerge. Most people unconsciously align themselves with one side or the other, either clinging desperately to order and control or abandoning themselves to chaos and unpredictability. The soul that has learned to dance with opposites recognizes that both order and chaos are necessary for creative living. Order without chaos becomes rigid, stagnant, lifeless. Chaos without order becomes destructive, overwhelming, ultimately meaningless. But when order and chaos learn to dance together, the result is what systems theorists call dynamic equilibrium, a state of stable instability in which structure and spontaneity, planning and improvisation, security and adventure can coexist in productive tension. This dance extends to the relationship between solitude and connection, between the hermit's necessary withdrawal and the equally necessary return to relationship. The soul that has withdrawn into solitude to discover its authentic nature must eventually learn to bring that authenticity into relationship without losing itself in the process. But relationship in turn provides the mirror and the challenge that solitude alone cannot offer, revealing aspects of the self that can only emerge through encounter with the other. The mature soul learns to move fluidly between these poles, sometimes withdrawing into solitude when the noise of relationship threatens to drown out the voice of inner wisdom, sometimes emerging into connection when isolation threatens to become narcissistic self-absorption. Neither solitude nor relationship is the answer. The answer lies in the dynamic balance between them, in learning to dance between withdrawal and engagement according to the soul's changing needs and the shifting demands of life. Perhaps nowhere is the dance of opposites more crucial than in the relationship between what we love about ourselves and what we reject, between the persona we present to the world and the shadow we hide from it. The conventional approach to personal development often involves trying to eliminate the shadow, to become purely the light aspects of our personality, while banishing or transforming the darkness. But Jung recognized that this approach leads not to wholeness, but to one-sidedness, not to authentic selfhood, but to a kind of psychological perfectionism that cuts us off from our own humanity. The dance of opposites reveals that light and shadow are not enemies but partners in the creation of a full human being. The shadow contains not only our rejected negative qualities, but also our unlived potential, our repressed creativity, our forbidden desires, our authentic wildness. To reject the shadow entirely is to reject vital aspects of ourselves, to become not holy but hollow, not pure but pale. The integration of shadow and light requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create a third thing that is neither pure light nor pure shadow, but a new synthesis that incorporates both. This third thing is not compromise, but transformation, not the watering down of opposites, but their creative fusion into something that transcends both while honoring each. This same transcendent function operates in the dance between tradition and innovation, between honoring the wisdom of the past and creating new possibilities for the future. The soul that has learned to dance with opposites neither rejects tradition as irrelevant nor clings to it as absolute truth. Instead, it engages tradition as a dance partner, sometimes leading, sometimes following, always in creative dialogue with the accumulated wisdom of those who have walked the path before while remaining open to insights and possibilities that have never existed before. The dance extends to the relationship between individual needs and collective responsibility, between the call to become authentically yourself and the call to serve something larger than yourself. The immature consciousness often sees these as conflicting demands. Either you focus on your own development or you sacrifice yourself for others. Either you follow your individual path or you conform to social expectations. But the soul that has learned to dance with opposites recognizes that true service to the collective springs from authentic individuality, and that authentic individuality finds its fullest expression in service to the whole. This integration of individual and collective happens not through compromise, but through what Jung called the realization of the self, that archetypal center of wholeness that is both most deeply personal and most universally human. The self transcends the ego's narrow concerns without negating them, includes personal fulfillment within a larger pattern of meaning and service. When you serve from the self rather than from ego inflation or ego deflation, individual and collective needs align naturally because both are expressions of the same underlying wholeness. The dance of opposites also transforms the relationship between effort and surrender, between the will to change and the acceptance of what is. The conventional mind often approaches transformation as a project to be accomplished through willpower, discipline, and strategic intervention. But this approach, while sometimes necessary, often creates its own form of rigidity and self-violence. The opposite extreme, passive acceptance or spiritual bypassing, may avoid the harshness of forced change, but often leads to stagnation and the perpetuation of genuinely harmful patterns. The soul that has learned to dance with opposites discovers a third way that is neither forced effort nor passive acceptance, but what might be called effortless effort, a way of engaging with transformation that combines clear intention with fluid response, focused will with radical acceptance, active participation with humble surrender to processes larger than personal control. In this dance, effort becomes not the forcing of desired outcomes, but the wholehearted engagement with whatever the moment requires. Surrender becomes not passive resignation, but active receptivity to the wisdom that emerges from the encounter between personal will and larger patterns of unfolding. The result is a way of living that is both highly intentional and deeply spontaneous, both personally directed and guided by forces beyond personal understanding. Jung recognized that this integration of opposites happens not through the dominance of reason, but through what he called the symbolic attitude, the to hold paradox without immediate resolution, to sit in the tension between opposing truths until a third thing emerges that honors both, while transcending each. This requires a fundamental shift in consciousness, from the either-or thinking that dominates rational discourse to the both and awareness that characterizes symbolic consciousness. The dance of opposites reveals that many of the conflicts that torment human consciousness are based on false either-or premises. We believe we must choose between security and freedom, between love and independence, between spiritual and material concerns, between individual fulfillment and social responsibility. But the symbolic attitude shows us that these are often false choices, that the mature soul can learn to hold both poles of any fundamental tension without being torn apart by their apparent contradiction. This holding of opposites in creative tension generates what Jung called the energy for transformation. Just as an electrical current flows between positive and negative poles, just as life emerges from the creative tension between order and chaos, so psychological growth springs from the conscious maintenance of productive oppositions rather than their premature resolution into one-sided solutions. The soul that has learned to dance with opposites moves through life with a quality of dynamic balance that the ancient Chinese called the middle way, not the static center between extremes, but the fluid responsiveness that can lean into whatever quality is needed in any given moment without losing its essential equilibrium. Sometimes this soul will appear fierce, sometimes gentle, sometimes active, sometimes receptive, sometimes rational, sometimes intuitive, not from inconsistency but from the wholeness that contains all possibilities within itself. This dance of opposites ultimately reveals the deepest paradox of individuation, that becoming most fully yourself leads not to separation from others, but to deeper connection, that embracing your unique nature connects you to the universal human story, that finding your individual path leads to participation in the collective journey of consciousness toward greater wholeness. The opposites dance not only within the individual psyche, but between individual and world, between personal transformation and collective evolution, between the journey inward toward authentic selfhood and the journey outward toward compassionate service. In learning to dance with opposites, your soul prepares for the next stage of its transformation, the recognition that its deepest wounds are not obstacles to overcome, but sacred doorways to walk through, not problems to solve, but initiations to undergo, not sources of shame, but wellsprings of wisdom that can serve both personal healing and collective healing. The dance of opposites teaches the fundamental skill required for this next threshold, the ability to embrace what you have rejected, to find gift within curse, to discover that what you thought was ending you was actually initiating you into a deeper level of being. In the deepest mystery of transformation, where the soul encounters the most profound paradoxes of existence, a revelation awaits that defies every conventional understanding of healing, growth, and spiritual evolution. Here, in the sacred crucible where pain is transformed into wisdom, your deepest wounds, those experiences that seem to shatter you, that appeared to be evidence of life's cruelty or your own fundamental brokenness, begin to reveal their true nature as doorways into dimensions of being that could never have been accessed through comfort, success, or the smooth path of an untroubled existence. This is perhaps the most difficult truth for the human heart to accept, that our greatest suffering often contains our greatest gifts, that our most devastating failures may be our most important initiations, that the very experiences we would most readily erase from our history are often the ones that have opened us to depths of compassion, wisdom, and authentic strength that we could never have discovered through any other means. Jung understood this profound alchemy when he spoke of the wounded healer, the recognition that those who can offer the deepest healing to others are invariably those who have walked through the fire of their own wounding and emerged not unscathed, but transformed. The journey into this understanding begins with a radical shift in perspective that challenges every assumption about what constitutes a good life, a successful path, or a desirable outcome. The collective consciousness, with its relentless pursuit of happiness, comfort, and the avoidance of pain, teaches us to view suffering as fundamentally wrong, as evidence of failure, as something to be eliminated as quickly and efficiently as possible. But the soul that has begun to awaken to its deeper nature discovers that this approach, while understandable, often prevents us from receiving the profound gifts that our wounds carry within them. This does not mean glorifying suffering or seeking pain for its own sake. Such approaches represent a different kind of unconsciousness, a masochistic inversion that misses the point entirely. Rather, it means learning to recognize that when suffering comes, as it inevitably does in every human life, it often arrives not as meaningless torment but as a fierce teacher, an initiatory experience that cracks us, open to aspects of reality, depths of feeling, and dimensions of wisdom that could never have been accessed through the protected pathways of comfort and success. The sacred wound operates as a doorway, precisely because it breaks through the ego's carefully constructed defenses, the personality's strategies for maintaining control, and the mind's illusions of separateness and invulnerability. In the moment of deepest wounding, whether through loss, betrayal, illness, failure, or any of the countless ways that life can shatter our assumptions about how things should be, the ordinary boundaries of the self become permeable. The wound creates an opening through which deeper truths can enter, through which the soul can touch dimensions of reality that were previously hidden behind the ego's protective walls. Jung recognized that the wounded healer archetype exists in every authentic helper, teacher, or guide. Those who can truly serve others in their healing are not those who have avoided wounding, but those who have learned to transform their wounds into wisdom, their pain into compassion, their brokenness into a deeper kind of wholeness that includes rather than excludes the reality of suffering. The therapist who has never known deep psychological pain may possess technique but will lack the visceral understanding that allows true empathy. The spiritual teacher who has never faced the dark night of the soul may offer concepts but will miss the lived wisdom that can only come through direct encounter with despair and the journey back to light. This transformation of wound into wisdom happens not automatically but through conscious engagement with the suffering, through what might be called a sacred relationship with pain, that neither runs from it nor wallows in it, but seeks to understand its deeper message and purpose. This requires a fundamental shift from the victim consciousness that asks, "Why me?" to the initiate consciousness that asks, "What is this here to teach me? How is this experience, however painful, serving my soul's evolution toward greater wholeness?" Such questioning does not come easily or quickly. The initial response to deep wounding is naturally one of shock, denial, anger, or despair, all necessary stages in the processing of traumatic experience. The transformation into wisdom requires time, patience, and often the support of others who have walked similar paths. But gradually, for those willing to engage consciously with their wounds, rather than simply endure them, a different relationship with suffering begins to emerge. You begin to notice that your capacity for compassion has deepened in direct proportion to your own suffering. The pain you have endured becomes a bridge of understanding to others who are in pain, creating a quality of empathy that could never have been developed through intellectual study or good intentions alone. Your heart, having been broken open, discovers that it now has room for griefs and joys that would have been incomprehensible to your unbroken self. The wound becomes a source of connection rather than isolation, a point of meeting with the universal human experience of suffering and transcendence. This process reveals one of the deepest secrets of the wounded healer path, that healing does not mean the elimination of wounds, but their transformation into sources of strength, wisdom, and service. The healer's wounds never fully disappear. They remain as sensitive points that can still ache, as reminders of vulnerability, as ongoing teachers of humility. But they are no longer sources of shame, weakness, or limitation. They have become sacred scars that mark the places where the soul has been cracked open to let more light in, where life has carved channels for deeper streams of compassion and understanding to flow. The wounded healer discovers that their greatest gifts to others often emerge directly from their deepest wounds. The person who has struggled with addiction may become a guide for others navigating the same treacherous territory. The one who has endured profound loss may develop an uncanny ability to sit with others in their grief without trying to fix or rush the natural process of mourning. The individual who has faced mental illness may offer hope and practical wisdom to those still in the darkness of their own psychological struggles. This is not simply about sharing war stories or bonding over mutual suffering. The wounded healer has done the deep work of extracting meaning from their pain, of finding the gold hidden within the lead of trauma, of transforming their personal wound into a universal medicine. They can offer not just sympathy but practical wisdom, not just understanding but tested strategies for moving through darkness toward light, not just companionship in suffering but guidance toward transformation. Jung's own life exemplifies this principle. His confrontation with his own unconscious during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of psychological crisis that lasted several years, became the source of his most profound insights into the human psyche. His personal descent into madness and his subsequent integration of that experience became the foundation for his revolutionary understanding of individuation, the collective unconscious, and the healing potential of psychological work. His wound became the doorway through which an entirely new understanding of human consciousness entered the world. The sacred wound operates as a doorway, not only into greater compassion and service, but into dimensions of spiritual reality that are often inaccessible through conventional religious or spiritual practices. Suffering has a unique capacity to strip away the superficial layers of personality, to burn through the ego's pretenses and delusions, to force an encounter with the most fundamental questions of existence. In the crucible of deep wounding, many people discover a direct relationship with the sacred that no amount of meditation, prayer, or study had been able to provide. This is not because God or the universe is sadistic, requiring our pain as payment for spiritual insight, but because suffering naturally breaks down the barriers that usually separate us from the deeper dimensions of reality. When the ego's defenses are shattered by trauma, when the personality's usual strategies for maintaining control prove inadequate, when the mind's familiar categories for understanding life are revealed as insufficient, the soul is thrown back upon resources it never knew it possessed. In this extremity, many discover a strength, a knowing, a connection to something larger than themselves that becomes an unshakable foundation for the rest of their lives. The sacred wound thus becomes a threshold experience, a rite of passage that initiates the soul into a deeper relationship with mystery, meaning, and transcendence. The person who emerges from deep wounding is not the same person who entered it. Something fundamental has shifted. Some essential innocence has been lost, but replaced by a more mature understanding of life's complexity and beauty. The wound has served as a kind of death, the death of illusions, of naivety, of the fantasy that life should be safe and predictable. But this death opens into a more authentic and resilient way of being. This transformation is visible in the quality of presence that emanates from those who have successfully navigated deep wounding. There is often a depth, a gravity, a groundedness that was absent before the initiatory experience. They carry within themselves the knowledge that they have faced the worst that life can offer and survived, that they have discovered resources of strength and wisdom they never knew they possessed. This knowledge creates a quality of fearlessness, not the absence of fear, but the confidence that fear can be faced and transcended when necessary. The wounded healer also develops what might be called a tragic optimism, an ability to fully acknowledge the reality of suffering, loss, and death, while simultaneously maintaining hope, love, and engagement with life. This is not the shallow optimism that denies or minimizes pain, nor the cynicism that sees only darkness, but a mature perspective that can hold both the terrible and the beautiful aspects of existence within a larger framework of meaning and purpose. This perspective recognizes that suffering is not the opposite of joy, but often its precursor and sometimes its companion. The heart that has been broken open by grief often discovers a capacity for joy that was previously impossible. The soul that has been humbled by failure often finds a success that is more meaningful than anything achieved through the ego's ambitions. The person who has confronted their own mortality often discovers a quality of aliveness that those who take life for granted never experience. The sacred wound becomes a doorway, not only into personal transformation, but into a deeper understanding of the human condition itself. Through your own wounding and healing, you discover that suffering is not a sign of personal failure or cosmic cruelty, but an integral part of the human journey toward consciousness and compassion. You begin to see that every person carries wounds, that everyone is struggling with some form of pain or limitation, that the human experience is characterized not by the absence of suffering, but by the capacity to transform suffering into wisdom, connection, and service. This recognition naturally leads to a more compassionate and less judgmental way of being in the world. When you have fully owned and integrated your own wounds, you no longer need to project your unhealed pain onto others through criticism, blame, or superiority. You can meet others in their struggles without needing to fix them or distance yourself from their pain, because you have learned to be with your own pain in a healing way. The wounded healer also develops a keen sensitivity to the healing process itself, an intuitive understanding of what is needed at each stage of recovery and growth. Having navigated their own journey from wound to wisdom, They can recognize where others are in their process and offer appropriate support without pushing, pulling, or trying to accelerate what can only unfold in its own time and way. Perhaps most importantly, the sacred wound becomes a source of what Jung called legitimate suffering, pain that serves a purpose in the soul's evolution rather than meaningless torment that leads nowhere. The wounded healer learns to distinguish between necessary and unnecessary suffering, between the pain that initiates and the pain that merely punishes, between the difficulties that promote growth and those that simply destroy. This discernment becomes a gift not only to themselves, but to those they serve. They can help others recognize when their suffering is serving a developmental purpose, and when it might be time to seek relief. When pain is opening doors to new possibilities, and when it has become a prison that needs to be escaped. When wounds are ready to be transformed into wisdom, and when they still need time and tending to heal properly. The transformation of sacred wounds into doorways ultimately reveals one of the deepest mysteries of existence, that what breaks us can also make us, that our greatest vulnerabilities often become our strongest gifts, that the very experiences that seem to destroy us can become the foundation for a more authentic and meaningful life. This is not a consolation prize for suffering, but the recognition that consciousness itself often requires crisis for its evolution, that the soul's journey toward wholeness inevitably involves the integration of darkness and light, wounding and healing, death and rebirth. In this recognition, your wounds cease to be sources of shame or limitation and become badges of initiation, markers of depth, evidence of your soul's commitment to growth regardless of the cost. You discover that you would not trade your scars for an unblemished surface, that the wound that nearly destroyed you has become the source of your greatest strength, that the doorway you least wanted to walk through has led you to treasures you could never have imagined. The sacred wound reveals itself as not only doorway but destination, the place where your deepest gifts await your discovery and your most meaningful service finds its source. There comes a moment in the deepening of your solitude when you begin to hear another voice within, not the familiar chatter of your conscious mind, nor the whispered doubts of your shadow, but something altogether different, something that speaks with an authority you have never claimed, yet recognize as profoundly your own. This voice carries the timbre of mystery, the cadence of the eternal feminine if you are a man, the strength of the eternal masculine if you are a woman. Jung named this inner figure the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of your psyche that has waited in the wings of your consciousness, patient as the moon, for this moment of recognition. You have spent so many years identifying with one half of your being, the half that society deemed appropriate, acceptable, safe. If you are a man, you learn to armor yourself in rationality, to speak only in the language of logic, to suppress the flowing rivers of emotion and intuition that welled up from unknown springs. If you are a woman, perhaps you learn to soften every sharp edge of your intellect, to apologize for your power, to channel your fierce knowing through acceptable vessels of care and nurture. But now, in this sacred wilderness beyond the crowd's boundaries, these forgotten aspects of yourself begin to stir. The awakening is not gentle. The anima does not tap politely on the door of masculine consciousness, asking permission to enter. She erupts like spring after the longest winter, wild, unpredictable, overwhelming in her abundance. She brings dreams thick with symbolism, fantasies that shake the foundations of your carefully constructed rational world. She speaks in the language of rivers and roses, of depth and darkness, of the cyclical wisdom that your linear mind has forgotten. For the man encountering his anima, this can feel like madness, as if the very ground of his identity is dissolving beneath waves of emotion he cannot name or control. And the animus does not announce himself with formal introduction to feminine consciousness. He arrives like lightning splitting the night sky, sudden, brilliant, undeniable. He carries the sword of discrimination, the fire of creative will, the capacity for action that cuts through the fog of endless consideration. He demands that you stop asking for permission to exist, stop seeking consensus for your truth, stop diminishing your power to fit into spaces too small for your soul. For the woman encountering her animus, this awakening can feel like revolution, as if every gentle accommodation she has ever made is suddenly revealed as a betrayal of her deeper nature. But this is the paradox that Jung understood so clearly. These inner figures are not foreign invaders disrupting your peace. They are the missing pieces of your wholeness, the aspects of divine humanity that a one-sided world forced you to exile. The anima is not separate from masculine consciousness, but its secret partner, the wellspring from which all true creativity and relationship springs. The animus is not alien to feminine nature, but its sacred complement, the flame that transforms gentle wisdom into world-changing power. You begin to notice how this inner figure has been trying to reach you through the people who have most disturbed your peace. Every woman who has ever unraveled a man's certainties, every man who has ever called a woman to claim her full authority. These were not accidents of attraction, but projections of the inner beloved demanding recognition. Jung saw this clearly. We fall in love not with the person before us, but with the inner figure they carry, the anima or animus seeking expression through relationship. But until we can recognize and dialogue with this figure within ourselves, we remain trapped in the endless cycle of projection and disappointment. The crowd cannot understand this awakening because it threatens their fundamental organizing principle, the rigid separation of masculine and feminine into opposing camps. They need you to remain half a person, playing your assigned role in their cosmic drama of separation. A man who claims his emotional depths and intuitive knowing becomes unpredictable, uncontrollable, dangerous to systems built on his predictable rationality. A woman who claims her intellectual fire and creative will becomes a threat to structures that depend on her accommodation and self-diminishment. But your soul has grown weary of this mutual mutilation. In the deepening silence of your solitude, you begin to sense the possibility of an inner marriage, not the external union that society celebrates, but the sacred conjunction of your own opposing aspects. This is the hieros gamos that mystics and alchemists have whispered about through the ages, the chemical wedding that transforms base consciousness into psychological gold. The process is not without its trials. Your inner anima may appear first as a seductive destroyer, luring your rational mind into chaos and dissolution. She shows you dreams of women with dark eyes and dangerous smiles, fantasies that make you question every solid thing you thought you knew about yourself. She brings emotions that flood your carefully ordered world, grief that arrives without warning, joy that overwhelms your defenses, anger that burns through your civilized constraints. To masculine consciousness, this feels like possession, like being taken over by forces beyond control or understanding. Or your inner animus may manifest as a harsh critic, a demanding tyrant who finds every expression of your feminine nature weak and insufficient. He speaks in the voice of absolute authority, cutting through your careful considerations with sharp judgments that leave no room for feeling or ambiguity. He pushes you toward achievements that exhaust your soul, toward a kind of masculine power that burns rather than illuminates. To feminine consciousness, this can feel like betrayal, as if your own psyche has turned against the flowing, receptive nature you have cultivated. These are the initial stages, the necessary chaos that precedes integration. Jung understood that psychological development requires the death of one-sided consciousness. the breakdown of rigid identifications that keep us trapped in partial existence. The man who has lived entirely in his thinking function must allow his feeling nature to disrupt his carefully ordered world. The woman who has identified solely with her receptive, adapting nature must allow her discriminating, initiating power to emerge, even if it temporarily destroys relationships built on her self-diminishment. But gradually, through patience and dialogue, these inner figures begin to reveal their true nature. The anima shows herself not as destroyer but as guide, the one who knows the pathways to the unconscious, who can navigate the symbolic realm where all genuine creativity is born. She becomes the bridge between conscious understanding and unconscious wisdom, the translator who can speak the language of dreams and symbols that your rational mind cannot decipher alone. Through her, you begin to access depths of knowing that no amount of analysis could reach, and the animus reveals himself not as tyrant but as ally, the one who carries the fire of discrimination, who can separate wheat from chaff, who provides the creative will to bring unconscious content into manifestation. He becomes the force that gives form to your flowing insights, that provides the courage to speak truths that others find uncomfortable, that refuses to let you diminish yourself for the comfort of those who cannot bear your full presence. Through him, you begin to access a kind of authority that needs no external validation. This inner marriage is not the fusion that obliterates differences, but the conjunctio that honors both unity and polarity. You remain essentially yourself. If you are a man, your masculine consciousness remains primary. If you are a woman, your feminine nature continues to be the foundation. But now you carry within yourself the complementary energy that makes you whole. You no longer need to project your missing half onto others, no longer need to seek completion through external relationships that inevitably disappoint. The crowd watches this transformation with suspicion and fear. They have invested so much in the war between masculine and feminine, in the story that these energies are natural enemies competing for dominance. A person who carries both energies in conscious relationship becomes a threat to this fundamental mythology. You can no longer be counted on to take sides in the eternal battle of the sexes. Your very existence suggests that the conflict they believe to be inevitable is actually a choice, a collective decision to remain divided against themselves. Men in the crowd may accuse you of becoming soft, weak, feminized, not understanding that claiming your anima actually makes you more authentically masculine, not less. They see your emotional depth as weakness because they have confused numbness with strength, rigid control with true authority. They cannot comprehend that a man who knows his own heart, who can navigate the depths of feeling and intuition, actually becomes more powerful, more creative, more capable of real leadership. Women in the crowd may judge you for becoming too aggressive, too demanding, too masculine, not recognizing that claiming your animus makes you more genuinely feminine, not less. They mistake accommodation for femininity, self-diminishment for spiritual virtue. They cannot see that a woman who knows her own mind, who can discriminate clearly and act with authority, becomes more radiant in her feminine essence, not diminished by it. But you begin to understand that these criticisms arise from their own terror of wholeness, their own fear of the inner work that integration requires. It is easier to remain half a person, projecting your missing aspects onto others, than to undertake the sacred marriage within yourself. It is safer to live in the familiar limitations of one-sided consciousness than to risk the expansion that psychological wholeness demands. The anima begins to appear in your dreams, not as the dangerous seductress, but as the wise woman, the priestess who guards the sacred mysteries. She may come as an ancient goddess carrying symbols of earth and moon, or as a young girl who holds the key to forgotten chambers of your soul. She teaches you that true masculine strength includes the capacity for receptivity, that authentic power can be gentle as well as fierce, that the greatest leaders are those who can feel as well as think. Or the animus manifests in your dreams as the wise king, the spiritual warrior, who fights not for conquest, but for truth. He may appear as an ancient sage carrying symbols of sun and sword, or as a young prince who calls you to claim the throne of your own authority. He teaches you that genuine feminine wisdom includes the power of discrimination, that true compassion sometimes requires fierce boundaries, that the deepest nurturing includes the courage to challenge growth. These inner figures begin to collaborate in the work of your individuation. The anima brings the visions. The animus provides the will to manifest them. The anima opens you to the flow of unconscious content. The animus gives you the discrimination to separate what serves from what merely comforts. Together they create a bridge between the worlds, the conscious and unconscious, the personal and transpersonal, the individual and archetypal. You notice that your creative capacity expands exponentially, where once you could access only the limited resources of your conscious mind. Now you can draw from the infinite well of the unconscious. Your anima brings you images, symbols, inspirations that your rational mind could never generate alone. Your animus provides the clarity and strength to give these visions concrete form, to birth them into the world despite the resistance they encounter. Your capacity for relationship also deepens and transforms. You no longer need others to carry your projected anima or animus. Instead, you can meet them as they actually are, not as the carriers of your missing parts. This creates space for genuine intimacy, relationship between two whole people, rather than two halves seeking completion through merger. The desperate quality leaves your connections, replaced by a generosity that springs from psychological abundance rather than need. The crowd finds this new quality in you unsettling. They are accustomed to relationships based on mutual projection and complementary incompleteness. A person who has achieved even partial integration of their contrasexual aspect becomes less controllable, less predictable, less dependent on others for psychological completion. You can offer love without demanding it, provide support without losing yourself, maintain your center even in the face of emotional storms. This inner marriage also awakens capacities that Jung called transcendent, abilities that emerge when the conscious and unconscious work in harmony rather than opposition. You begin to access intuitive knowing that arrives complete without the need for logical deduction. You develop what feels like prophetic vision, the ability to see patterns and possibilities that others miss. Your creative expression becomes a channel for transpersonal energies, producing work that seems to come through you rather than from your personal efforts alone. But perhaps most significantly, this integration of anima and animus prepares you for the next stage of individuation, the encounter with the self that Jung recognized as the organizing center of the psyche. The inner marriage creates the psychological vessel strong enough to contain the tremendous energies that this encounter releases. You become capable of bearing the tension of opposites without splitting, of holding paradox without forcing premature resolution, of living in the questions that have no simple answers. The crowd cannot understand this preparation because they live in a world of either-or, where truth must be simple and solutions must be final. But your inner work has taught you the wisdom of both and, the capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without losing your center. You begin to see that most human conflicts arise from the inability to contain paradox, the desperate need to make complex realities conform to simple categories. As this chapter of your individuation unfolds, You realize that the anima and animus are not just personal psychological contents, but bridges to the collective unconscious, connections to the eternal archetypal energies that have shaped human consciousness throughout history. Through your inner feminine, if you are a man, you connect to the Great Mother, the Wisdom Sophia, the Divine Bride who has inspired seekers across cultures and centuries. Through your inner masculine, if you are a woman, you link to the Wise King, the Eternal Father, the sacred warrior who has guided humanity through its greatest transformations. This realization brings both exaltation and terror. To carry these archetypal energies consciously is to accept a responsibility that extends far beyond personal healing. You become a vessel through which eternal patterns can manifest in contemporary form, a bridge between the timeless and the temporal. The crowd may see only your personal eccentricity, but you begin to sense that your individuation serves purposes larger than your individual healing. The integration of anima and animus prepares you for this greater calling by ensuring that you can channel archetypal energies without being possessed by them. The man who is consciously related to his anima can receive feminine archetypal content without losing his masculine ground. The woman who has integrated her animus can embody masculine archetypal power without betraying her feminine essence. This psychological balance becomes crucial as individuation deepens and the encounter with transpersonal energies intensifies. You stand now at a threshold that the crowd cannot even perceive, much less understand. Behind you lies the familiar world of collective identity and projected wholeness, the comfortable prison of partial existence. Ahead lies the unknown territory, where individual consciousness begins to serve transpersonal purposes, where personal healing becomes a gift offered to the collective healing of humanity itself. The anima and animus, now recognized and partially integrated, serve as your guides for this next stage of the journey. They carry the wisdom of the eternal feminine and masculine, the knowledge of how individual consciousness can become a vessel for archetypal expression without losing its human grounding. Through them, you begin to understand that individuation is not selfish self-improvement, but sacred service. The development of consciousness capable of bearing and transmitting the healing energies that our divided world desperately needs. As this awakening deepens, you realize that the inner marriage you have achieved is both personal accomplishment and archetypal pattern, both individual healing and collective symbol. You have become a living demonstration that the war between masculine and feminine is not inevitable, that consciousness can hold opposites in creative tension rather than destructive conflict. Your very existence becomes a healing presence in a world torn apart by false polarities. The crowd may never understand this gift you carry, may continue to see your integrated wholeness as threatening to their familiar divisions. But the deeper currents of human consciousness recognize and respond to the harmonized energies you embody. Without speaking a word about psychological theory, you become a transmission of the possibility for inner peace, for the kind of wholeness that could heal not just individual souls, but the collective wounds that keep humanity trapped in cycles of conflict and separation. This is the sacred responsibility that integration of anima and animus ultimately reveals. Not just personal completion, but the capacity to serve as a bridge for others, a demonstration that the opposites can dance together rather than destroy each other. Your inner marriage becomes a seed of hope for the outer marriage that humanity so desperately needs, the reconciliation that could transform our species from a collection of warring fragments into a conscious unity that honors both diversity and connection. There comes a moment in your journey away from the crowd when the very fabric of reality begins to shimmer with meaning. What once appeared as random events now reveal themselves as threads in an intricate tapestry being woven by forces beyond ordinary understanding. Jung gave this phenomenon a name, synchronicity, but the word itself cannot capture the profound shift in consciousness that occurs when you begin to live in constant dialogue with the meaningful coincidences that surround you like a secret language spoken by existence itself. The crowd dismisses such experiences as mere chance, statistical inevitabilities in a universe governed by mechanical causation. They have trained themselves to see only the surface of events, to register only the literal meaning of what occurs around them. To them, finding the exact book you need at the precise moment you need it is simply coincidence. Meeting a stranger who carries the answer to your deepest question is just luck. Discovering that your dreams anticipate external events is mere projection, the mind's tendency to create patterns where none exist. But you have learned to recognize the signature of synchronicity, that peculiar quality that distinguishes meaningful coincidence from mere chance. These events arrive with an emotional charge that cannot be explained by their literal content. They create a sense of rightness, of being aligned with currents larger than your personal will. They often involve symbols or themes that have been emerging in your inner work, as if the external world is confirming and amplifying the movements of your soul. The mechanics of synchronicity remain mystery, even as its reality becomes undeniable in your experience. Jung understood that these events operate through what he called a causal connecting principle, a way of linking inner and outer phenomena that bypasses the chains of cause and effect that govern mechanical processes. It is as if consciousness and matter dance together in patterns that rational analysis cannot fully comprehend, creating bridges between the psychological and physical realms that make meaningful coincidence not only possible, but inevitable for those whose awareness has been prepared to receive it. You begin to notice that synchronicities cluster around periods of psychological transition, appearing with particular intensity when you are on the threshold of significant change. During times of crisis or transformation, when the familiar structures of your identity are dissolving and reforming, the boundary between inner and outer worlds becomes more permeable. What Jung called the constellation of archetypal energy creates a field of meaning that draws relevant experiences from the apparent randomness of daily life. The first synchronicities often appear as confirmations, external events that validate the direction of your inner journey just when doubt threatens to overwhelm your courage. You may be questioning whether your departure from collective values is wise, wondering if your growing solitude indicates mental imbalance rather than spiritual development. Then a book falls open to exactly the passage you need to read, or a conversation overheard in passing addresses, precisely the fears that have been haunting your nights. These events arrive with such precise timing and relevance that their meaning transcends their probability. As your sensitivity to synchronicity develops, you begin to recognize more subtle forms of meaningful coincidence. Number sequences that repeat with uncanny frequency, each appearance marking moments of particular significance in your process. Animals that appear at symbolically appropriate times, their behavior or mere presence carrying messages that your rational mind could never decode, but your soul understands immediately. Weather patterns that mirror your emotional states, storms arriving with your inner turmoil, clear skies blessing your moments of psychological breakthrough. The crowd finds these observations disturbing because they threaten the mechanistic worldview that keeps their universe predictable and controllable. If consciousness can influence external events through non-causal means, if meaning can manifest through matter in ways that bypass linear causation, then the sharp division between subject and object, inner and outer observer and observed, begins to blur. This blurring terrifies those who have built their identity on the illusion of separation, who need to believe that consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of brain chemistry, with no power to influence the material world. But your experience tells a different story. You witness how your psychological state affects the kinds of events that constellation around you. Periods of inner harmony tend to synchronize with external ease and flow, while times of psychological conflict often coincide with mechanical breakdowns, communication failures, and obstacles that seem to mirror your internal resistance. This is not magical thinking, but recognition of the subtle ways consciousness and matter interpenetrate in patterns that materialistic science has not yet learned to measure. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious provides a framework for understanding how these connections might operate. If individual consciousness participates in a deeper layer of shared psychic reality, then synchronicities may represent moments when this underlying unity breaks through the surface of apparent separation. The meaningful coincidences that guide your path are not random events interpreted by a meaning-hungry mind, but expressions of the same intelligence that orchestrates the movements of your soul from within. You discover that synchronicity often operates through what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to bridge conscious and unconscious content. When you are genuinely open to guidance, when your ego will has learned to cooperate with deeper currents of purpose, synchronistic events begin to function as external reflections of internal processes. The outer world becomes a mirror in which you can read the movements of your soul, a library where the books you need are always available if you know how to look. This recognition transforms your relationship with uncertainty and change. Where once you demanded guarantees before taking risks, now you learn to read the synchronistic signs that indicate when movement is called for, even if the destination remains unclear. A sudden opportunity that aligns with your deepest values, an unexpected encounter that opens doors you didn't know existed, a loss that forces you toward growth you would never have chosen. These events begin to feel less like random occurrences and more like invitations from a wisdom larger than your conscious planning. The crowd cannot understand this way of navigating life because it requires a kind of trust that their conditioning has systematically undermined. They have been taught to rely only on logical analysis, provable cause and effect relationships, and strategies based on known variables. Synchronicity asks you to include factors that cannot be quantified, to trust patterns that emerge from mystery, to act on guidance that arrives through channels your rational mind cannot validate. Yet as you learn to live in partnership with synchronicity, you discover a kind of intelligence at work that far surpasses the capabilities of rational planning alone. The meaningful coincidences that guide your path seem to know things about your future development that your conscious mind cannot anticipate. They lead you toward people and experiences that prove crucial to your growth, often through connections so unlikely that only in retrospect can you see how perfectly they served your deeper purpose. Dreams begin to participate more actively in this synchronistic weaving. Images that appear in your sleep manifest in waking life with startling frequency and precision. You dream of a red door, and the next day encounter exactly such a door at a moment of important decision. You dream of an old man with specific features, and within days meet someone who matches the description precisely, carrying knowledge or perspective you desperately need. The boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness becomes more fluid as both realms collaborate in your guidance and growth. These experiences gradually reshape your understanding of time itself. Linear time, with its rigid sequence of past, present, and future, begins to feel like only one layer of a more complex temporal reality. Synchronicities often involve what Jung called meaningful simultaneity, events that occur at the same time without causal connection but with profound symbolic relationship. The phone rings just as you think of someone, bringing news that addresses exactly what you were pondering. You arrive at a location precisely when you need to witness something crucial to your understanding. But synchronicity also operates across time in ways that suggest past, present, and future interpenetrate more than linear consciousness recognizes. Events that seem random when they occur reveal their meaning weeks or months later, as if your soul was being positioned for experiences that couldn't be anticipated by conscious planning. Decisions made in response to synchronistic guidance prove their wisdom only after their consequences unfold over time, creating trust in forms of knowing that transcend temporal logic. The crowd finds this relationship with non-linear time particularly threatening because their entire social structure depends on the illusion that the future can be controlled through rational planning and willful effort. Institutions, careers, and relationships are all organized around the assumption that cause and effect operate in predictable sequences that human intelligence can manipulate for desired outcomes. A person who lives in responsive relationship with synchronicity becomes unpredictable in ways that challenge these assumptions. You may leave secure employment to pursue work that feels meaningful but offers no guarantees, trusting synchronistic signs that suggest this path serves your deeper development. You may end relationships that appear successful but feel spiritually deadening, following inner guidance that promises nothing but authenticity. From the crowd's perspective, these choices appear irrational, even self-destructive. They cannot see the intelligence that guides such decisions because they have lost touch with the currents of meaning that run beneath surface appearances. As synchronicity becomes a regular feature of your experience, you begin to recognize different qualities and types of meaningful coincidence. Some synchronicities carry warning, steering you away from paths that would compromise your developing authenticity. Others provide confirmation, validating directions that your rational mind questions, but your soul recognizes as necessary. Still others function as teaching, bringing you experiences or information that address specific needs in your psychological development. You discover that your attitude toward synchronicity affects its frequency and intensity. Periods of deep trust and openness tend to coincide with rich synchronistic experiences, while times when you retreat into purely rational approaches often mark decreases in meaningful coincidence. This is not because you create synchronicities through belief, but because your receptivity affects your ability to recognize and respond to the meaningful connections that are always available. The quality of your attention becomes crucial to this process. Synchronicity requires a particular kind of awareness, relaxed but alert, open but discriminating. You learn to maintain peripheral vision while pursuing conscious goals, staying available to information and opportunities that arrive through unexpected channels. This is the awareness Jung called floating attention, a state of receptive alertness that can register subtle patterns and connections that focused concentration would miss. Your relationship with ordinary planning and goal setting begins to evolve as synchronicity plays a larger role in your navigation. You still make conscious plans and work toward chosen objectives, but you hold these intentions lightly, remaining open to course corrections that arrive through synchronistic guidance. Your goals become more like compass headings than rigid destinations, providing direction while allowing for the discoveries that can only emerge through responsive engagement with unfolding circumstances. This flexibility often looks like indecision or lack of commitment to those who live by willful goal achievement. They cannot understand how someone can be both purposeful and yielding, directed and responsive. But you discover that this paradoxical approach actually increases your effectiveness, allowing you to pursue your deepest intentions while remaining available to opportunities and insights that rigid planning would miss. Synchronicity also begins to affect your relationships with others, both deepening existing connections and bringing new people into your life through meaningful coincidence. You notice that certain individuals seem to be synchronized with your development, appearing at crucial moments with exactly the perspective or support you need. These soul-level connections transcend ordinary social categories, creating bonds based on shared participation in deeper patterns of meaning and growth. The crowd finds these synchronistically formed relationships suspicious because they don't follow conventional social rules. These connections may bridge age gaps, social classes, or cultural differences that normally create barriers. They may develop with unusual speed and intensity, creating intimacy that seems inappropriate by conventional standards. But you recognize these relationships as expressions of the same intelligence that orchestrates your inner development, bringing you into contact with other souls who are traveling similar paths or carrying complementary pieces of the puzzle you are trying to solve. As your sensitivity to synchronicity matures, you begin to recognize that you are not merely a passive recipient of meaningful coincidences, but an active participant in their creation. Your consciousness, aligned with deeper currents of purpose, becomes part of the field that constellates synchronistic events. You may find that your presence seems to catalyze meaningful coincidences for others, as if your alignment with synchronistic flow creates conditions that allow others to encounter their own guidance more easily. This recognition brings both empowerment and responsibility. You realize that your psychological state and spiritual alignment affect not just your own experience, but the field of possibility that surrounds you. Your commitment to authenticity and growth creates resonance patterns that can support similar developments in others, while your retreats into fear or conformity may dampen the synchronistic potential of any situation you enter. The deeper implications of synchronicity begin to reshape your understanding of consciousness itself. If meaningful coincidences represent genuine connections between inner and outer events, then consciousness cannot be the isolated, powerless phenomenon that materialistic science describes. Instead, it appears to be fundamentally connected to the fabric of reality in ways that allow psychological states to influence material events through channels that bypass mechanical causation. This understanding doesn't make you grandiose or magical in your thinking. You recognize that synchronicity operates within natural laws, even if those laws include principles that current science has not yet discovered or acknowledged. Your participation in synchronistic flow doesn't give you power over external events, but rather aligns you with intelligences and purposes that are larger than your personal will, while still including and honoring your individual role in their unfoldment. The crowd's fear of synchronicity ultimately stems from its implication that individual consciousness matters in ways that extend far beyond personal experience. If your psychological development can influence the kinds of events that constellation around you, then the choice between authenticity and conformity becomes not just personally significant, but cosmically relevant. Your individual journey toward wholeness participates in larger patterns of meaning and evolution that connect your growth with the healing and development of consciousness itself. This recognition transforms your understanding of solitude and separation from the crowd. What might appear as lonely isolation reveals itself as participation in a more intimate relationship with the intelligence that orchestrates existence itself. Your departure from collective consciousness doesn't cut you off from meaningful connection, but opens you to forms of relationship and guidance that operate through different channels than social convention provides. As this chapter of your individuation deepens, synchronicity becomes less a series of remarkable events and more a constant quality of your relationship with existence. You learn to live in ongoing dialogue with the meaningful patterns that surround and include your personal journey. Your life becomes a conversation between your conscious intentions and the larger intelligence that speaks through circumstances, opportunities, and encounters that arrive with perfect timing and profound relevance to your deepest needs and questions. The path ahead remains uncertain, but uncertainty no longer feels like abandonment. Instead, it becomes the space where synchronicity can operate, where the unknown can introduce itself through meaningful coincidence and guide your steps toward discoveries that conscious planning could never anticipate. You walk now not just with your own limited knowledge, but with the support of an intelligence that expresses itself through the very fabric of existence, weaving your individual story into patterns of meaning that connect your personal healing with the great work of consciousness itself. There comes a moment in the depths of your individuation when you must face the most terrifying truth of psychological transformation, that authentic rebirth requires genuine death. Not the death of the body, which the crowd fears above all else, but something far more intimate and complete, the death of who you thought you were, who you were taught to be, who you have spent decades carefully constructing from the expectations and demands of others. Jung understood this necessity with crystalline clarity. The old identity must die completely before the authentic self can be born from its ashes. This death begins not with dramatic revelation, but with a slow, creeping sense that the person you have been living as feels increasingly foreign, like clothes that no longer fit a body that has grown beyond their constraints. The roles you have played with such dedication, the dutiful child, the successful professional, the accommodating partner, the responsible citizen, begin to feel like elaborate performances you can no longer sustain. The energy required to maintain these personas becomes exhausting, as if you are carrying the weight of lives that were never truly yours. The crowd watches this dissolution with mounting alarm because your identity crisis threatens the stability of their entire social system. They need you to remain who they think you are, to continue playing the role that their own sense of security depends upon. Your mother needs you to remain the child whose achievements reflect her worth as a parent. Your employer needs you to remain the worker whose predictable compliance serves their organizational machine. Your friends need you to remain the person whose familiar reactions make their own choices feel validated and safe. But the deeper currents of your psyche have begun to reject these borrowed identities with increasing vehemence. What Jung called the self, that organizing center of wholeness that transcends ego consciousness, refuses to be confined within the narrow boundaries that collective expectations have drawn around your existence. This refusal manifests first as restlessness, then as rebellion, and finally as a kind of psychological death that feels more real and absolute than any physical dissolution you could imagine. The process unfolds in stages that mirror the death-rebirth cycles Jung observed in his study of alchemical texts and mythological patterns. The first stage is what the alchemists called nigredo, the blackening, the descent into darkness where all familiar forms dissolve into primordial chaos. You begin to experience what mystics have long recognized as the dark night of the soul, a period when everything that once gave your life meaning becomes hollow and meaningless, when all your accomplishments feel like sand castles built by someone else's hands. This dissolution strikes at the very foundation of your sense of self, the stories you have told about your life, about your successes and failures, your relationships and achievements, your values and beliefs, begin to feel like elaborate fictions created to maintain an illusion of coherent identity. You realize with growing horror that you have been living as a character in other people's dreams, shaped by their projections and expectations rather than your own authentic nature. The crowd interprets this dissolution as mental illness, spiritual crisis, or moral failure because they cannot comprehend that psychological death might be a necessary passage rather than a pathological condition. They rush to offer remedies, therapy to restore your former functioning, medication to eliminate your discomfort, advice to help you get back to normal. They cannot see that normal was precisely the problem, that the identity they want you to recover was itself a form of spiritual death that masqueraded as successful living. But you have moved beyond the reach of their remedies because you have begun to recognize that this death is not happening to you, but through you, as if forces deeper than personal will have taken control of your transformation. The dissolution feels less like breakdown and more like breakthrough, not the collapse of something healthy, but the disintegration of something that was never truly alive, only animated by the borrowed energy of collective expectations. The family identity that once seemed so fundamental begins to crumble as you recognize how much of your sense of self was constructed from roles assigned before you were old enough to choose them. The responsible oldest child, the rebellious youngest, the mediator who keeps everyone happy, the achiever whose success validates family worth. These identities feel increasingly like prison cells, disguised as homes. You begin to see how family systems unconsciously conspire to keep each member locked in fixed roles that serve the system's stability rather than individual growth. This recognition brings grief that cuts deeper than ordinary mourning because it involves the loss of belonging that once felt like the bedrock of your existence. To shed the family identity means to accept exile from the tribal warmth that once made you feel safe and valued. The child within you cries out against this abandonment, preferring familiar prison to unknown freedom. But the self refuses to be satisfied with borrowed belonging, demanding instead the authentic connection that can only emerge from genuine individuality. Professional identity often proves equally illusory under the pressure of this psychological death. The career you built so carefully, the expertise you developed so diligently, the professional persona you crafted so skillfully, all begin to feel like elaborate masks, hiding an essential emptiness. You realize that you have been living someone else's definition of success, climbing ladders that lead to destinations you never truly chose, measuring your worth by standards that have nothing to do with your soul's actual values and aspirations. This professional dissolution often triggers the crowd's most intense resistance because economic identity forms such a crucial pillar of their social structure. They need you to remain productively engaged in systems that depend on your willing participation. Your questioning of professional identity threatens not just your own economic security, but their faith in the entire framework of meaning that organizes their collective life. They cannot afford to acknowledge that much of what they call meaningful work might actually be soul-deadening labor disguised as purposeful activity. The social identity that once provided such reliable validation also begins to disintegrate under the pressure of authentic becoming. The person you are at parties, in groups, in public spaces, this socially competent performer who knows exactly how to please and charm and fit in, starts to feel like a stranger whose motivations you can no longer understand or endorse. The energy required to maintain social personas becomes unbearable as the gap widens between who you are becoming and who others expect you to remain. This social death often manifests as increasing inability to engage in superficial conversation, to pretend interest in activities that feel meaningless, to laugh at jokes that aren't funny, to agree with opinions that violate your emerging sense of truth. The social skills that once came so naturally begin to feel artificial and exhausting. You find yourself unable to perform the elaborate dance of mutual deception that passes for normal social interaction. The crowd experiences this withdrawal as rejection and judges it harshly because your authentic presence makes their own social performances feel exposed and false. Your inability to play the familiar games makes everyone uncomfortable, reminding them of depths they have learned to ignore, of authenticity they have traded for social acceptance. Your very existence becomes a mirror that reflects their own compromises and accommodations, their own betrayals of authentic selfhood. Religious or spiritual identity, if you have carried one, often dissolves with particular violence during this phase of psychological death. The beliefs that once provided such comfort and certainty begin to feel like borrowed garments that never truly fit your actual spiritual experience. You realize that you have been worshiping concepts rather than encountering the divine directly, following prescribed paths rather than walking your own way toward mystery and meaning. This spiritual dissolution can be especially disorienting because it strips away not just superficial identities, but the very framework of meaning that once made existence comprehensible. The God you were taught to worship feels increasingly foreign, the prayers you were taught to recite increasingly empty, the spiritual community you once found so nourishing, increasingly constraining. You enter a wilderness where familiar spiritual landmarks have vanished, leaving you alone with questions that have no comfortable answers. The death of identity extends even to the most intimate aspects of your sense of self. The personality traits you thought were essentially you, your humor, your preferences, your ways of thinking and feeling, begin to feel like acquired characteristics that served adaptive functions rather than expressions of essential nature. You start to wonder who you would be if you stopped performing even for yourself. If you dropped all the ways you have learned to be a recognizable, consistent person. This questioning reaches into the deepest layers of psychological identity, challenging even your sense of being a separate individual with clear boundaries and fixed characteristics. The ego structure that Western psychology takes as the foundation of healthy functioning begins to feel like a construction project maintained by constant effort rather than a natural fact of consciousness. You glimpse the possibility that individual identity itself might be a kind of useful illusion that can be transcended without losing functional capacity. Jung understood that this complete dissolution of identity serves the crucial function of clearing space for the emergence of the authentic self. The old identity structures, no matter how successful or well-adapted, eventually become constraints that prevent further development. Like a snake that must shed its skin to continue growing, consciousness must periodically shed fixed identities to allow for expansion into greater wholeness and authenticity. But the passage through this death feels anything but natural or comfortable. You experience periods of profound disorientation when you literally do not know who you are or what you want or how to navigate even simple decisions. The internal compass that once guided your choices has vanished along with the identity structures it served. You feel like a ghost haunting your own life, present but not substantial, conscious but not coherent. Dreams during this period often feature images of death, dissolution, and destruction that feel more real than ordinary dream content. You may dream of your own funeral, of buildings collapsing, of floods that wash away everything familiar. These dreams are not pathological symptoms, but accurate representations of the psychological process unfolding within you. The unconscious uses the imagery of death because that is precisely what is occurring. The death of false identities to make room for authentic being. Physical symptoms often accompany this psychological dying as the body responds to the dissolution of the identity structures that once provided such reliable organization for your entire system. You may experience fatigue that sleep cannot cure, illnesses that have no clear medical cause, or a general sense of physical fragmentation that mirrors your psychological condition. Your body is learning to exist without the familiar patterns of tension and energy that maintained your old identity, and this reorganization can feel profoundly destabilizing. The crowd's attempts to help during this period often intensify your distress because their remedies are designed to restore the very identity structures that need to die. Well-meaning friends offer advice about how to get your life back on track, not understanding that the track itself was part of the problem. Family members express concern about your changes, attempting to pull you back into roles that feel increasingly impossible to inhabit. Professional helpers may pathologize your experience, missing the transformational significance of what appears to be dysfunction or crisis. But occasionally you encounter someone who recognizes the sacred nature of your dissolution, who can witness your dying without trying to resurrect your former identity. These rare souls, often those who have undergone their own psychological deaths, offer the kind of presence that can hold space for transformation without trying to direct or control it. Their recognition that death can be a doorway rather than an ending provides crucial support during the most disorienting phases of your journey. As the death process deepens, you begin to experience what Jung called the mortificatio, the complete putrefaction of the old identity that must occur before new life can emerge. This phase involves a kind of psychological rotting where even the remnants of your former self begin to decompose. You may feel disgusted by your past choices, embarrassed by your former beliefs, ashamed of the person you used to be. This is not neurotic self-criticism, but the necessary breakdown of attachments that keep consciousness bound to outgrown forms. During this darkest phase of the dying process, you may experience what feels like complete emptiness, a void where your identity used to be. This is the alchemical stage of dissolution, where all forms return to prima materia, the primary matter from which new creation can emerge. You feel like nothing and no one, a pure consciousness without content, awareness without object. This emptiness terrifies the ego mind, but represents the fertile darkness from which authentic selfhood can be born. The crowd cannot tolerate this emptiness and will do everything possible to fill it with familiar content, to reconstruct your identity along recognizable lines. They offer you new roles to play, new identities to adopt, new ways to be someone comprehensible within their framework of meaning. But you have learned to recognize these offerings as elaborate forms of spiritual abortion, attempts to prevent the birth of authentic selfhood by returning to the womb of collective identity. Instead, you begin to cultivate what Jung called holding the tension, the capacity to remain present with uncertainty, emptiness, and dissolution without premature resolution. You learn to bear the anxiety of not knowing who you are without rushing to fill the void with borrowed content. This tolerance for unknowing becomes crucial to the transformation process because it creates the psychological space necessary for genuine novelty to emerge. The death of identity also involves the dissolution of the future as you imagined it, the death of dreams and plans that were based on the person you thought you were. Career goals that once motivated your efforts lose their appeal as you recognize they belonged to someone else's vision of success. Relationship patterns that once felt natural become impossible to sustain as the person who engaged in them dies away. Life plans that once provided security and direction crumble as their foundation, your fixed sense of self, dissolves into uncertainty. This future death can be as disorienting as the dissolution of past identity because it leaves you without the forward trajectory that once organized your present choices. You exist in a kind of eternal now, unmoored from both the story of who you were and the vision of who you would become. This temporal dissolution reflects the death of linear identity, which depends on narrative continuity to maintain its coherence across time. But in this death of past and future identity, you begin to glimpse something that has been present all along but hidden beneath the layers of biographical accumulation. Jung called this the eternal self, the aspect of consciousness that exists beyond, the story of becoming that simply is rather than develops or changes. This deathless core of being becomes more apparent as the mortal identities that once obscured it dissolve into the darkness of unknowing. The recognition of this deathless essence does not immediately end the dying process, but begins to provide a different context for understanding its necessity. You start to see that what is dying was never truly alive in the first place, that the identities you are shedding were always temporary constructions that served their purpose but were never meant to last forever. The authentic self, which Jung understood as the goal of individuation, was always present, waiting for the false selves to die so it could finally breathe and express itself in the world. As this chapter of your transformation nears completion, the death process begins to reveal its secret purpose. All the dissolving, all the emptiness, all the loss of familiar identity has been preparing space for something unprecedented to emerge. Not a new version of your old self, but an entirely different quality of being that could never have developed within the constraints of borrowed identity. The death you have endured was not punishment or pathology, but the necessary prelude to a birth that will transform not just who you are, but what you are capable of becoming. The crowd will never understand this death because they live in terror of losing the identities that feel like their only protection against chaos and meaninglessness. But you have discovered that identity itself can become a prison, that consciousness can become trapped within its own constructions, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is to allow everything you think you are to die so that everything you actually are can finally come to life.